Was working the evening shift at a gas station. Man comes in all disoriented. I go to help him out. He has a gash on his head and doesn't know where he was. I couldn't see any crashes around, so assumed he had fallen or something. Normally, we are supposed to stay inside the glass-shielded register area whenever anyone is in the store. I, being a nice human being, went to help while calling the police/EMS. They got there and checked him out. They thought his head may have been fractured. Took him to the ER. I went back to work. Cops stopped back by for some coffee a few hours later. They told me the guy got hit by a baseball bat trying to break into a little girl's bedroom and was wanted for rape and murder in 2 other states. I never left the register area at night again.
Kudos to the slugger that hit him.
You sending him to the ER probably helped with the police getting a hold of him.
I think you did the right thing regardless. If for nothing else, you made sure he didn't bleed out before facing the justice he so rightfully deserved.
The Lake Nyos disaster. Wikipedia, org/wiki, Lake Nyos disaster. The lake periodically belches a cloud of invisible carbon dioxide gas that suffocates everything within a 16-mile radius. In 1986, over 1,700 people and all their livestock died without even understanding what was happening to them.
My science teacher in high school was in the Peace Corps, and one of the first people to come across this village after it happened. He said it was so eerie because all the flies and mosquitoes had died, and it was so silent.
Just imagine swimming or standing near a lake and it just randomly starts fizzing, like someone shook and opened a giant can of soda. That's basically what happened. Some lakes have fountains in them to prevent this from happening.
Remember seeing a documentary about this. Crazy stuff.
The story of Mary Vincent always stands out to me. In 1978, 15-year-old Mary was hitchhiking. A man named Lawrence Singleton picked her up. He brutally raped her and eventually made her get out of the car. She planned to run, but he noticed and cut both her arms off. He threw her into a ditch ravine and left her to die. She packed her stumps with mud to stop the bleeding and spent all night crawling out. She eventually makes it to the highway and starts walking, naked and covered in blood. The first car that saw her sped away in fear. The second car was a couple on their honeymoon. They picked her up and she survived. Edited to add, I was in a rush when I wrote this, so you should definitely read more into the story. It's crazy. From the horrific act itself, to the court proceedings, to the fact that he hardly served any time.
What really upsets me most about this is that Singleton was released from jail for good behavior and went on to murder a different woman a few years later, Roxanne Hayes.
The part of this story that fucked me up was she tried to run. He grabbed her by the arm and turned and hacked her with the hatchet. She said she watched as her dismembered arm clung to his forearm after he separated it.
It wasn't just a ditch. It was a steep embankment where the highway had been built up, approximately 30 feet deep. She climbed up 30 steep rocky feet after having her forearms chopped off and being brutally raped and survived. Bass, SSDGM.
John List, HSLN M, Wikipedia org/wiki, John List, killed his whole family, wife, mother, daughter, and 2 sons. He meticulously planned the whole thing, canceling all delivery services, excusing the kids from school, and even turned the air conditioning as low as possible to preserve the bodies for as long as possible. After he killed them all, he placed the bodies in sleeping bags and lined them up. He then wrote a letter to his pastor explaining why he had to kill them. He then leaves and isn't heard from again. 18 years later, he's remarried and doing the same job as before, but this time he doesn't have any children. He's finally arrested after a tip was given to the FBI. Crazy thing is that because he planned it so well, the bodies weren't discovered until a month after the murders, so he had a huge head start and essentially started a new life in the same career and was heavily involved in a new church down in Virginia. Took 18 years to capture him.
What did the letter say that he left?
Fun fact, his original family home, the one where he murdered his family and left their corpses to rot, had a previously noticed original Tiffany stained glasses window worth around $500,000. He cited financial strain, not wanting his family if he was broke, as part of the reason for murdering them. Whoopsie.
The horror movie The Stepfather is based on his life. Interesting thing is that it was released a few years before List was even caught. Very good movie. Edit. For those confused, I'm talking about the 1987 movie, not 2009. The original is a classic. The remake is garbage.
One of my friends had someone following her home, hiding in the bushes so they couldn't be seen. She booked it to her house, got inside, and he was watching the house from the outside. She called the cops. They come along quietly and got the jump on him. He had condoms, handcuffs, and a knife. When they got his DNA, it turned out that he was linked to a half-dozen rapes in the area. She credits her regimen of running sprints to outrunning him that night, and firmly believes she would have been raped if she couldn't outrun him then.
Not trying to make light of the story or anything, but he actually had condoms. Never thought of a rapist doing protected sex.
What a disgusting fuck. That type of human trash who would force himself inside someone else like that are the type of people I wish I could purge the fuck out of.
In my town in the early 90s, there was a notorious killer that had all of BC, Canada, on watch. My wife's mother, years and years before I knew them, had been home alone while her husband was in England doing tree surgeon work, arborist. She was in her laundry room when a man walked up from her basement, completely scaring her. She freaked out and said, "What the hell are you doing here?" He said he was friends with her husband and was just coming to see if he was here. Apparently, he told him he could just walk in, which she knew was bullshit. She was smart enough to tell him that he was just at the store and would be back any minute. He said he would wait outside for him. As soon as he left, she called the police, but he was long gone by the time they got here. 2 weeks later, the killer was caught, his mugshot put on TV, and it was the guy in her house. Edit. The guy's name was Terry Driver. Here's a link to his EN, Wikipedia, /wiki.
My family has a similar story, and I'm pretty sure some of you serial killer buffs out there might figure out who it is before the reveal, because their story is pretty unique. When my parents were in college, they went on a trip down to Florida. They had met through mutual friends, and were down there together, but hadn't gone on a date yet. My dad and one of his friends were planning to meet my mom and some of her friends at a hotel, but being the carefree college guys they were, they lost track of time, and realized it was impossible to get to the hotel on time by walking. They decided the best solution to their problem was to hitchhike, and a car with 2 women picked him up. Everything seemed fine until the driver asked them if it was okay to stop for gas. My dad and his friend agreed it was no problem since they were making good time, and she drove into a gas station. She then pumped her car full of gas before hopping back in and flooring it, basically stealing the gas with 2 hitchhikers in the back. My dad and his friend were beginning to freak out when she pulled a gun from under her seat and asked, "Are we going to have a problem?" or something like that. My dad and his friend shook their heads vehemently, because what else do you do in that situation? She then drove them to the hotel and dropped them off without so much as a scratch, and they kind of thought nothing of it until the news started reporting on a serial killer in Florida known as Aileen Wuornos. He took one look at her picture and instantly recognized her as the driver. The only reason my dad thinks she didn't straight up kill them was because they were super polite and respectful to her and her victims, were usually scumbag guys trying to take advantage of her. TLDR, Aileen Wuornos is the reason my dad got to his first date with Mom on time. Edit. Spelling.
Holy shit, this is horrifying. What a smart woman.
My great aunt knew the person I think you're talking about. He was good friends with her son, and he had come over for dinner one night. After he had left, my great aunt told her son that she didn't like him and said he didn't feel right. A few months later, he was caught after a woman saw him watching her outside of her house in our small town where everyone knows everyone, and she was eventually questioned by the police about him. No one in my family knew about this until a few months ago when she finally told us after we were talking about him. So scary.
This user's comments have been overwritten to protest Spez and Reddit's actions that will end third-party access and damage the community.
Naglaria, is terrifying to me. You can get it just from getting water up your nose, swimming in a lake, or, I've heard, but I'm too lazy to check, there have been people who got it from using a neti pot.
The childhood best friend of one of my exes died this way. Maybe not of this exact amoeba, but a waterborne amoeba that ate him neurologically. I did not know there was such a thing at the time. I had no fucking idea. So when my ex told me about this, I laughed. I assumed he was pulling my leg, being an asshole, lying to me. No, it was absolutely true, and I was the asshole. I have had an absolute horror of these amoeba ever since. When signs say, do not swim, there's a really good fucking chance they're indicating something like this. Don't fucking swim, people. Don't swim. Which, of course, that poor little boy cannot be blamed for. How absolutely awful.
Yeah, definitely I read that. If you're showing symptoms of rabies, you're dead. Same with cancer. If you're far enough along to show physical symptoms, you're just dead. There's nothing you can do.
3 sailors survived the sinking of the USS West Virginia at Pearl Harbor, only to die 16 days later due to the lack of air. The Navy knew they were there, but couldn't get to them. 16 days to new War History Online com/featured Pearl-Harbor 16 days to die. HTML.
I don't know which is worse. Surviving for 16 days waiting to be rescued, or being on watch listening to your friends trapped inside, knowing that you can't help them. Horrific for both. But damn.
16 days? I would have just gone to Boeing and said, yep, we got nothing, see what you can do. What's the worst that you do? Kill them.
My dad and some friends got drunk and went for a drive on some back roads and were going as fast as the truck would go as teenagers. My dad was slightly less drunk than the others and eventually demanded they let him get out. They pulled over and he and one other girl got out. He and the girl started walking to town while the other 3 sped off in the opposite direction. Well, less than a mile up the road from where they got out is an extremely sharp turn, which they missed and hit a tree going pretty close to triple digits, miles per hour. 2 of them died on impact, and the only reason the 3rd survived is because they crashed in front of a house that 2 doctors lived in. The survivor was paralyzed and lost his leg and part of his arm and was in the hospital for 8 months before dying. This was in the 60s, so medical care wasn't what it is today. When I first got my permit, my dad took me to that corner to explain the importance of safe driving. It gave me goosebumps about how close he was to being in the truck. He said that the dad of the driver got what remained of the truck to be hung up in the center of town for months after, to be a warning to all.
That's terrifying. I missed a situation like this years ago. Was hanging out with a buddy at the bars, and we leave to go back to his place for some smoke and video games. His roommate comes home from work, he was a bartender, and tells us he's heading out to the bars and asks if we want to go. He'll drive. We go back and forth, but eventually decide to stay in. Turns out, the buddy had been drinking heavily at work, but we couldn't tell. He ended up flipping his Jeep off of an overpass and dropping 20+ feet. The entire back of his Jeep, where I would have been sitting, was crushed into the back of the front seat. The roll bar was smashed into the passenger side. Buddy ended up getting some serious brain injuries and spent the next few years learning how to walk and talk again. He's still pretty off and much different than he used to be. My other buddy and I came very close to a similar or worse fate.
Your dad's like, what do we say to the god of death?
This is a hometown story that stayed with me. It happened literally right around the corner from where I grew up, maybe a 2-minute drive away. Judy Kirby murdered 6 children and 1 adult by intentionally driving the wrong way on a divided highway in an attempt to commit suicide. She had been hospitalized for depression, but had also just ended a relationship with her ex-husband's brother and was by some reports involved in drug trafficking and fearing an imminent arrest. She picked up her sister's son, who was celebrating his 10th birthday that day. She then loaded her 3 children into the car, supposedly to pick up a gift for the nephew. Instead, she went missing with the carload of kids. A short time later, calls started coming in to 911 about a car going the wrong way down the highway at a high rate of speed. They made it about 90 seconds before a head-on collision with another vehicle, driven by a father with 2 children and another child along for the ride. The crash annihilated both vehicles. The only survivors were Kirby herself and the child who was along for the ride in the other car. There were pieces of children all over the highway. She was sentenced to 215 years in prison.
This sounds exactly like the story of There's Something Wrong with Aunt Diane, another real-life event where a woman drove a van full of children down the wrong way while being high on some drug before eventually hitting another car and killing herself and the kids. Really odd the similarities between Judy Kirby and Diane Schuler's cases. Edit had forgotten the details of Diane's case, but she had apparently been horribly drunk, empty handle of vodka found at the scene, plus blood alcohol content twice the legal limit in autopsy, and had tested positive for THC in her system.
How do people do shit like that? My grandfather was an engineer architect for U.S. Steel through the early 70s. One day, a coworker who was getting divorced brought his young son and young daughter for a tour of a steel mill, proceeded to bypass the admittedly lax security of the 60s, picks up his kids and jumps with them into some molten steel. People that kill kids are horrifying, but parents who kill their own kids, Jesus. Edit. My grandfather never shared any more of the story than what I described. Didn't think he would have, but checked with my dad, who also asked what happened. Grandfather said they got rid of, didn't use that batch of steel, whatever that means.
Jesus Christ. I'm glad she has to live with that for the rest of her life.
Years ago, when I was 8, my family lived in this big, weird house, kind of on the edge of a small town. The school district was in the middle of a big restructuring, so even though we were only a couple grades apart, my brother and I went to different schools and took different buses. This left me as the last person to leave in the morning and the first person to get home in the afternoon, which meant it was my job to make sure all the lights were off and the door was locked. One morning, I noticed the basement door was open and the light was on. So before I left, I turned off the light and closed the door. When I got home that afternoon, the light was on and the door was open again. I just assumed that I'd forgotten to actually take care of it when I noticed it in the morning, so I went over to turn off the light and close the door. When I got to the top of the basement stairs, I looked, and there was a big shadowy male figure towards the bottom of the staircase. I freaked out, slammed the door, and pushed a bunch of boxes against it, and then went and hid in my closet. For months, I didn't tell my family because I was positive what I had seen was a ghost and didn't think anyone would believe me. Then about a year after that incident, my mom and her boyfriend realized that small amounts of money had been going missing for months, totaling around $800 to $900, but never more than $60 at once. So we all walked around the house with flashlights, trying to figure out how they could have gotten in. Turns out some creep was climbing in through a small hole in the outside of the house, shimmying through a crawl space, then coming up into the house through the basement. Realizing I had been alone in the house with him on at least one occasion was one of the worst, most terrifying moments I've ever had. Edit. Whoa, this blew up way more than I expected. I'm doing my best to respond to comments, questions. Sorry if I end up missing yours.
Home invasion is seriously one of the scariest things that can happen to a person. The home is like a final refuge from the world, and to have it violated like that is so unnerving.
That is hella creepy.
You think you were scared? Imagine the bloke's face whenever the door would suddenly slam behind him and the lights would go out. Edit. Thanks to the Redditor for my first gold.
My brother's ex-GF had 2 older sisters. They died before she was born. One day, they decided to play hide-and-seek or something. So anyway, they both climbed inside a chest and accidentally locked themselves in. They suffocated.
That is terrifying. It's particularly terrifying to me because I remember when I was younger, something similar almost happened to me and my cousin. She had a daybed, and we decided to get behind it and push it against the wall so we could play and nap in the dark. It got unbearably hot, and we realized we couldn't breathe after about 30 minutes. If it wouldn't have also gotten so hot from our fear, body heat, lack of oxygen, We might have actually suffocated because we were getting lightheaded. It was scary, but eventually we pulled the bed away from the wall. I have no idea how that could happen on carpet. Bizarre freak accidents are just so strange. I'm truly sorry for you brothers, XGF. Edit, the bed.imgur.com/01/01zit.
That really sucks. When I was a kid, there were a lot of PSA type things about kids not playing in abandoned refrigerators for that reason.
Wow, I actually know about something very similar, except it was two brothers. They were also playing hide and seek, except they both climbed into a refrigerator. Incredibly sad.
Tough to pick just one, because there is true evil in humanity out there. Stuff like the blood eagle ritual is pretty awful. But in terms of really scary, probably stuff that just kind of happens on accident. Like the story of Kyle Plush. Just awful. He was in a minivan that has one of those back seats that you can push backward to lay flat in the trunk for extra storage space. He went to grab something in the trunk, leaning over the seat, and it tipped backward and pinned him, upside down, against the back of the car, in a position such that he couldn't get himself out. He called the police twice. The second time he called and gave them a very clear description of the car. Plush called 911 again at around 3:35 p.m. Police said this time he provided a description of the vehicle as he desperately pleaded for help but couldn't hear the dispatcher. Isaac said the information didn't get relayed to officers at the scene. "This is not a joke," the teen said over 911. "I'm almost dead." He asked the dispatcher to tell my mom I love her if I die. 8 TBC 13, teen who suffocated in van tell my mom I love her, /3336194. Just a horrible random accident that could have happened to anybody. This kid didn't go looking for trouble, like he didn't try and go down a chimney, or go caving like other people who have gotten stuck and suffocated. He was just reaching for something in his trunk, got pinned, and then was not found in time. Nightmarish for the kid and his family.
I still don't get why the hell they couldn't have gotten to him in time. His parents have filed a lawsuit over this, because honestly, there's no reason that child should have died as long as he was on that phone with 911.
I don't regret many things in my life, but I regret this one deeply. I was leaving work. 2001, I believe, so while cell phones were common, not everyone had them. I worked in a small office building, you know, those kind that rent out spaces to several small businesses. I had stayed late on day, only reason I feel as bad as I do. As I was leaving, I was the only other car in the lot. I noticed the property manager, an elderly lady and very sweet, getting out of her car next to the dumpster holding a bag of trash. I drove past her, turned the corner, and went home. This was on a Friday night. Come to find out, she didn't put her car in park. I get in Monday to the news that she was pinned between the dumpster and her car until found on Sunday. Our dumpster was not visible from any main road. Had I been 30 seconds later in leaving, I would have seen it happen. Being elderly, the low impact still pinned her and broke some bones. Even though she was found alive, she didn't make it at the hospital. I don't know if I had seen it happen. I would have been able to react fast enough to warn her, jump out and push the car. It wasn't accelerating, just rolling slowly in neutral. Or, if I had, would have even just been able to call 911 and her injuries treatable after not being outside for 2 days. And I can't imagine her mindset. We were in a commercial area, no real reason for anyone to be immediately within earshot if she called for help, which I'm sure she did, many times.
Reminds me of the story of John Jones, all that's interesting, calm/nutty putty bash cave, who was exploring a cave with some friends and family, wedged himself into a tight spot where he couldn't turn himself around or crawl backwards. Rescuers tried to get him out and got kind of close at one point, but ultimately they were unable to get him out and he died. His body is still there, and the cave was ultimately sealed so it wouldn't happen to anyone else.
Nutty Putty Cave in Utah was sealed up in 2009 after John Jones was trapped upside down in a small crevice while spelunking. When rescue teams finally arrived, he had been upside down for so long that his legs were drained of blood. The only possible way to have gotten him out was to break his legs, which would have sent him into fatal shock. He died after being trapped for 28 hours. His body's still in the cave.
Didn't they almost get him out? But then one of the pulleys snapped, and he got trapped even worse. That's my personal nightmare.
Don't hate me for this comment, but if they were already certain he was gonna die, wouldn't it have been okay to at least attempt to break his legs and pull him out on the rare chance he survived, or that wasn't possible either?
I went through the Nutty Putty Caves in 2003 with a group of high school friends. We went through the spot where he got stuck, the Virgin Canal. I was 5'2" and 100 pounds at the time, and I had a panic attack thinking I was never coming out of that canal alive. There was a few guys in our group that had to back up out of there because they wouldn't fit. One of the worst experiences I have ever had. His death hit me hard, thinking that could have been someone from our group.
There was a woman who worked in a science lab who spilled 2 drops of organic mercury on the back of her gloved hand. Those 2 drops destroyed her entire nervous system and brain. YouTube.com/watch Viki NJ7M01JV58.
The mercury story always scares the crap out of me because I used to work in a lab and we had a compound that could go through gloves. I read the materials safety data sheet before I handled the compound, something you're always supposed to do, and it warned that proper personal protective equipment should be worn and that the compound was a horrible, toxic carcinogen. Not knowing that it could go through gloves, none of us did. We began handling it. I got some on my palm and continued working. It only took like 5 seconds for my hand to feel warm and strange. So I removed the glove and there was a large splotch on my left palm. I immediately went to wash up, scared for my life. It went through my skin immediately, and it also targeted the nervous system. But I ended up being fine due to minimal exposure. I can't remember what compound it was now because it was so long ago, but it had a lot of P words. Scary stuff. There's nothing scarier than working in a lab and knowing you're doing everything right just to have it all go wrong.
Yep, I'm familiar with that story. Dimethylmercury went right through the latex gloves.
I knew that was going to be a Chubby Emu video. Nope. I can handle a lot of shit, but his videos make me viscerally uncomfortable. I simply cannot watch them.
I'll tell you one that happened to me, or rather, I was witness to. One night, I was out at a bar with a friend I was visiting in New Rochelle, NY. We went outside for a cigarette, and a car came flying past the bar. The car burned through a red light and started going up this hill that was on a curve. We watched as he veered over the double yellow and smashed head-on with another car coming from the other direction. Both cars' hind ends lifted up, then slammed down. The car that was driving correctly burst into flames. I ran inside and grabbed the fire extinguisher, then yelled to the bartender to call 911 and say there has been an accident. My friend, a few other patrons, and me ran to the cars. Now, I used to think this was a fictional trope, but I was pretty drunk before this happened, and I swear it sobered me up instantly. I tried spraying the fire, but it did nothing. The fumes and heat were awful, and all we could do was stand back. The worst part was, and this will haunt me forever, was that the woman in the burning car was screaming as she died. My God, it was the worst sound ever. The fire department came and put the fire out. The police took us back to the bar and took statements. I found out the next day in the news that the car that was not speeding was being driven by a young woman coming home late from work. She was a block away from home, and I think she was either newly married or a new mother. The rotten motherfucker driving the other car was some rich, drunk cocksucker. He lost a leg, but otherwise was physically unharmed. I have no clue if he did time, as I left to go back home a day or so later. I'm trying to find a link for the news story, but I can't, as this was maybe 6 or 7 years back. I remember it being reported on Low HUD and Channel 12 News.
This is probably the thing that freaks me out the most. The entire randomness of it, and yet it is fairly common. I work as a firefighter and have seen plenty of drunk driver caused deaths. Rarely, I have a quick mini freak in my head while I'm driving, but then I convince myself it probably won't happen to me.
I think what's more scary than this is that stories like this are a dime a dozen.
Years ago, my now husband worked for an industrial laundry company, in their head office when a PR disaster happened that also mentally screwed up a number of people. Their company collected laundry from large hospitals and medical-type businesses, egg care homes, etc., and cleaned them. You can imagine the sort of heavy-duty cleaning, bleaching, boiling, etc., needed to remove those sort of biological contaminants. One day, a laundry cart went through the usual bleaching, boiling cycle before it dropped out into a conveyor belt to be sorted for drying, pressing, when there was a horrid scream. A small newborn baby's body had been discovered tangled up amongst the sheets. It had been cooked. The laundry workers were distraught. The whole place had to be shut down. Police called, and the laundry tracked back to the hospital to discover what happened. It turns out thankfully, in some ways, stillborn baby had been left in the cot, waiting to be taken down to the hospital mortuary after the parents had said their goodbyes and covered it with a blanket. But somehow one of the nurses hadn't realized, just on shift was the best guess. So just grabbed up all the linen out the cot and off the bed in the delivery room with the body bundled inside and emptied it into the laundry hamper's trolley thing. The other nurses' parents assumed the baby had been collected by the mortuary to be stored awaiting their funeral decisions. The laundry was found not to be to blame, but the parents were devastated, and the hospital took a lot of flack. The poor laundry workers who discovered the body ended up being given counseling before eventually quitting. The laundry did amend its practice to individually emptying each laundry hamper into the industrial machines instead of just tipping them in to stop anything like that happening again. Edit, just found it in the newspaper. Turns out I misremembered the how of getting into the laundry basket. Slightly wrong. https://www Daily Mail Co.
I had to dig through my hospital's biohazard trash because a nurse had thrown out a fetus. Probably the worst day of work I've ever had. Eat it. Yikes, this blew up. I'm trying to get to all the questions, but I am at work. I'll try to catch up.
Holy shit. Also, on first reading, I thought the baby screamed and was still alive.
Oh my God, I am so sorry for those workers, those parents, your husband by proxy to it all. Wow, that is just so utterly terrifying to have first seen that baby and had no idea how they came to be there. My God.
On September 20th, 1987, in Bellingham, Washington, a Georgia Pacific paper mill worker was sent to inspect a heat exchanger system in the steam plant. Inside the base of the stack, he spotted a charred skeleton. To this day, no one is certain who the victim was, how they wound up in such a horrible place, nor why. Local paper, http BellinghamHerald.com news/article 1732625WB Bellingham Herald com/news/article 1736266 HTML. Good YouTube video on the subject. YouTube will continue equals 1 and Kim Sviji equals swatch time continue into 3U.
You know shit is real serious if the sentence starts with the complete date.
Lockout tagout rules are there for a reason.
The Toy Box Killer, Wikipedia.org/wiki, David Parker Ray, and his transcripts Thinking About Philosophy, blogspot.com/20/Parker Days, audio tape-transcript, HTML. If you absolutely want to have your day ruined, this has to be one of the most disturbing, creepiest things ever. Serial killer David Parker Ray would play these tapes for his victims, so they had an idea of what was coming and to also mentally break them. Hear the start of one tape to give you an idea. Hello there, bitch. Are you comfortable right now? I doubt it. Wrists and ankles chained, gagged, probably blindfolded. You are disoriented and scared too, I would imagine. Perfectly normal, under the circumstances. For a little while at least, you need to get your shit together and listen to this tape. It is very relevant to your situation. I'm going to tell you, in detail, why you have been kidnapped, what's going to happen to you, and how long you'll be here. I don't know the details of your capture, because this tape is being created July 23rd, 1993, as a general advisory tape for future female captives. Can you imagine how terrifying it would be to wake up in a place you didn't know and have someone play these tapes for you, telling you what horrible things were going to happen to you before you died?
If I remember correctly, he had accomplices, people who were aware. That's seriously fucked up on so many levels.
Holy shit! Numerous individuals, including members of law enforcement, were accomplices in the torture and raping box. Victims who escaped had their reports ignored by local law enforcement too.
I think the real crazy part is that they'd never actually prove that he killed anyone. Allegedly, he would just dope the living shit out of the victim and basically hypnotize them until they lost their memory of what happened, and then set them free in a remote location.
I remember this poor kid who went missing while I was at Purdue. HMS News UNS Purdue, /2007A/070320. Police Steffi HTML. He was trying to come home to his dorm after a party and either wasn't able to get into the building or perhaps wanted to bypass the check-in desk. Just a guess based on my experience as a student there. Since he had been drinking, he entered the building through a door to an electrical closet that should have been locked and was electrocuted and killed that night. He was last seen January 13th, and the body was discovered March 19th after reports of foul odors at the dorm. Edit: the body was found at Owen Hall, year 2007. I remember talking with friends about theories of what happened when he went missing. How terrifying it must have been to find out there was a dead body in your dorm for months. Update: thanks for the silver. And thanks everyone for contributing the memories and other details lingering questions. Sorry if any current Purdue folks are feeling weirded out. Be safe and stay out of the maintenance closets.
Kid committed suicide in the dorm room directly across from mine. He was in a single bedroom and taped up around the door ahead of time as he didn't want someone coming in to stop him. The results were no one did for a couple months. The smell ended up going through a vent into the bathroom next door to his room, so everyone kept thinking there was bathroom issues. The hallway carpet was professionally cleaned multiple times in attempt to get the dead fish odor out. Finally, a resident advisor found him when his parents repeatedly called saying they hadn't heard from him and hadn't been able to reach him for months. Edited to add, wasn't at Purdue, was another university.
I remember this. We had search parties checking under cars in long-term parking, scouring the field by the airport, the Hort Park woods, checking drainage ditches and dumpsters, and not one trace of him turned up. It was like he just vanished.
CBC/Canada British Columbia /lack of oxygen killed 4 at BC mine report 580 CBCA at him lack of oxygen killed lad 4 at BC mine. Guy goes into a small building and dies. Later, he shows up and sees the body, calls 911 and then dies. Paramedics show up to help them, then die. The reason? Oxygen levels at head height were normal. Oxygen levels went bent over was basically zero. Bending over in this room killed 4 people by asphyxiation. Edit: they could breathe. The air they were breathing contained no oxygen. The human body can't tell the difference.
My BF works in a coal mine and told me that there are places where taking a shit can kill you. Like in the story above, the oxygen level at head height is fine, but there's carbon monoxide closer to the ground. You squat to take a shit and die. Edit: actually it's carbon dioxide, not monoxide. Thank you for telling me. Sorry for the confusion.
I took a confined spaces class at work today, and they had an example video of this scenario. Crazy how quickly you can pass out and die with oxygen levels below 12%.
This is the first time that I've been able to contribute to a story like this, and I honestly wish I couldn't. A friend of mine is a paramedic in BC, and he has enough shitty stories of his own to last a lifetime. But by far, one of his worst involves this very story. He was working with one of the 2 paramedics who died that day and was supposed to be on shift when this happened, but called in that morning and the guy who died took the shift. He said that he saved a lot of lives over the years, and yet his biggest regret was the time he saved his own.
My wife arrived at her parents' house that she was currently living in due to health issues of her father's. She got into the house, no one else was there at the time, and instead of going further in, stopped in the first room that held the computers, which was right by the door. She went into the room and was messing around on the internet when one of the cats came into the room. Her cat, to be precise. Well, this cat was super laid back, loved everyone, and never picked fights or got aggressive. He would literally lay down and let squirrels throw pecans at him from trees and do nothing but take it. Not tonight, however. Tonight, he was growling and hissing intermittently while standing between my wife and the entrance to the rest of the house. A laid-back, sweet old cat was acting like he was going to rip out a throat. Well, my wife decided that this was really fucking weird, so she picked up her cat and left the house. Lo and behold, she sees a cop car patrolling down her street and flagged them down. She explained the situation and they demanded that she stay in their cruiser while they both checked it out. Turns out they found the back door wide open, super bad. Her parents and her never leave the door unlocked, much less open. She came to find out later from those cops that they were hunting down a serial rapist that had been spotted in the area, and that was why they were rolling down a safe, normally residential street. Super spooky. Life pro tip: always trust the cat.
I used to have an incredibly chill, skittish little Siamese cat. Not a fighter, not a ruffian. She would hide under the bed when anyone but me was in the house. Landlords and repair workers would say, "I thought you said you had a cat." But she was extremely loyal to me and bonded to me. I was living in an attic apartment where the front door opened onto stairs, and then the stairs went straight up into the living room. One night she is standing at the foot of the stairs inside the house, yowling her fool head off, just howling and yowling and really going to town. I'm half asleep and listening to her and wondering WTF, wishing she would stop. Then I hear it. A hand grabs the doorknob and turns it. Click, turns it again. Click, turns it again. Click. Someone is quietly but forcefully trying to jimmy open the door by twisting the doorknob hard in the middle of the night. Boom, I'm awake. My feet are on the floor. I'm like immediately vertical. And my cat races to the top of the stairs, looks me in the eyes, and falls silent. She had done her job and gotten my ass up. This is about 2 a.m., and my boyfriend at the time would sometimes come home super late from his overnight job. So, the first thing I do is call him and whisper, asking him if he's trying to get in the front door. He says, "What? Fuck no. Call the cops now. Turn on all the lights in the house, make noise, get off the phone with me and call the cops. Then call me right back." I do that, and the doorknob stops. The cops come and search the area and the block and find no one. It never happened again. After that, I also barricaded the door. I'll never forget that what could have been an extremely dangerous, if not potentially brutal situation in the middle of the night was foiled by my gentle little scaredy cat Pussycat with big saucer eyes, who was terrified of her shadow. But when shit got real, she woke my ass up. I couldn't have asked more of a dog. Cats are badass. Never doubt it. My girl has gone on across the rainbow bridge, as they say, but I'll always treasure her loyalty and intelligence in this.
Holy crap, I have a similar story. Relative of mine was in college and living in a small off-campus house by herself. At the time, she thought she might have had a stalker. She had gotten some strange phone calls, no one answering on the other end, heavy breathing and that sort of thing, among other things. One night, she is home alone in her bedroom studying, just her and a cat that she had recently adopted. So recent, in fact, that she hadn't even named the cat yet. The whole time she is studying, the cat is acting crazy, pacing the floor, meowing constantly, and sitting right in front of her closet, meowing non-stop. She's getting really annoyed and finally has enough, so she gets up and goes to the closet to open it for the cat and hopefully shut him up. When she opens it, there is a man sitting in her closet, and when she opened it, it startled him, so he jumps up, pushes her out of the way, and bolts out of the house, literally ripping a hole in the screen door as he tore through it. She calls the cops, of course, gives a description. She had a clear look at his face. They find and arrest him. Turns out he was also a serial rapist. He had been stalking her for weeks and broke into her house to wait in her closet until she was asleep, at which time he would pull his mask down and rape her. Same pattern with his other victims, but she was the only one to see his face. Her testimony put him in prison. The cat saved her. Always trust the cat.
There's a book called The Gift of Fear, which is about how powerful our human intuition is for protecting us from violence. This reminded me of a part where the author explains how we often invest a lot in dogs' intuition for dangerous situations people. But what's really happening is that the dog is an expert at reading you, and therefore reacts when you are intuitively sensing danger, fear, even if you don't necessarily consciously realize you are.
Happened to me. Have posted about it before. I was around 11 years old, and I woke up in the middle of the night to a man straddled on top of me with his hand over my mouth and nose. He told me to roll over and not scream. I rolled onto the floor and tried to scream bloody murder. I say tried, because when you are truly terrified, it can take a second to find your voice. My mom heard me screaming and came in and fought with the guy. He was at least 6. She was 5'3", and scared him enough with the fighting and screaming that he took off out the window he had come in through. Never did catch him.
Hold the fuck up for a moment. What the fuck?
I'm glad you're okay, and your mom sounds like a badass. I'm just imagining this little berserker lady coming at this tall dude like a blood-hungry badger, all teeth and nails while howling, "Get away from my baby!"
Similar story. When I was about 8, I woke up to a man standing over me. I screamed as loud as I could and banged on the wall. My mother, who was in her early 60s, came rushing into my room with a broom and beat him with it until he crawled back out the window, then chased him out of the yard. She called the police in the morning, but they never found him, even though he left his duffel bag and tools. Shortly after we moved out, the upstairs apartment was broken into and they were killed in their sleep. I still don't like being home alone at night. Before I fall asleep, I like to think about all of the random objects in my room. I can use as weapons, like my salt lamp. I'll smash a dude's face in, if I have to.
Have you heard of the Nazis so bad that other Nazis, in particular fellow SS Nazis, constantly tried to get him and his unit disbanded and arrested? No? Well, his name was Oskar Dirlewanger, and his unit was nicknamed the Black Hunters, or the Dirlewanger Brigade. Oskar Dirlewanger was an early adopter of the Nazi Party. He had been thrown in jail before for being a pedophile. Eventually, when World War II broke out and healthy, ideal Germans were dying in droves on the Eastern Front, Oscar's old pal, Heinrich Himmler, head of the SS, granted him a command of a unit made up originally of German poachers, and eventually German criminals being held in civilian jails/camps, and military criminals. His unit was essentially designated as a rearguard unit meant to hunt down enemy partisans, or in most cases, civilians in occupied countries. Oskar Dirlewanger SS unit was responsible for many atrocities, some atrocities so barbaric and bad, other SS units reported him and his unit for atrocities. A few examples, which have been popularized in film, include taking an entire village in Belarus and putting them in a church, locking the doors, and setting the church ablaze. Anyone who tried to escape was shot by machine guns and rifles. This unit raped, tortured, and murdered its way through Eastern and Central Europe. During the Warsaw Uprising, they were sent to help squelch the uprising. One of their atrocities committed was going into a children's hospital, telling the nurses and staff that they were there to secure the church. Okay, once the church was secured, they raped the female staff and some of the wounded and sick female children victims, and then went around shooting everyone. If anyone was found to have survived, they were bayoneted. These guys were so horrible that other Nazis looked down their noses at them and constantly filed complaints and reports against them, but with no real success. Thankfully, by the end of the war, this unit was destroyed, and its leaders and criminal soldiers were hunted down like rabid animals.
From an article, the Red Army pushed west and a Soviet soldier shot him in the chest. Dirlewanger survived and went into hiding. French authorities later captured him in Altschausen in southern Germany after the war. They tossed him into a camp to await trial, but he never made it. The French authorities at the time claimed Dirlewanger died of natural causes, but the man's cellmate said he watched as Polish guards beat him to death. If Polish guards did beat him to death, then it was an appropriate end to one of World War II's most savage war criminals.
Can I vomit now, or?
Holy shit, fuck that guy.
A high-priority inmate who could implicate dozens of wealthy and powerful people apparently committed suicide while on suicide watch at his prison. and the footage can't be found due to a malfunction of the camera. But the news told me that's how it happened, and the news is never wrong.
His island is known in the area as Ped Island for years, but the authorities raided this island only weeks after he is arrested. The night before he dies, his roommate is transferred to another cell, and hours before 2,000 pages of his court files are released. The documents include names of movie stars and aristocrats, but patriots are in control, so don't worry.
He wanted to kill himself so badly that there's 2 bullet holes through the back of his head.
He wasn't on suicide watch at the time, but then the question shifts to why on earth wasn't he?
Told this here before, but once more. My friend had this neighbor who was a retired mechanic. They lived on some properties with large front lawns and long driveways. His neighbor had a couple derelict cars parked up near his garage that he took parts from occasionally. This neighbor of his started hearing noises while sitting in his living room coming from his front yard. Every time he'd go to the window, there would be nothing there. He assumed it was a raccoon or a coyote or whatever. He kept hearing the noise, so he'd go outside to look around, but would find nothing. He'd put out traps and occasionally catch something, yet the noise persisted. Soon, he started claiming that he was hearing voices coming from the front yard, like whispering. He'd go outside and look around the perimeter of his property, but would find nothing. It was persistent, so he'd started calling the cops. Every time the cops came and looked around and would find nothing. So they told him he needed to stop calling them for this, and perhaps get a security camera or whatever. So this guy thought he was losing his mind. One summer evening, he couldn't sleep, so he went to the back patio to smoke a cigarette. Suddenly, he heard voices coming from the front of his house. He put his cig out and snuck around to the front and got there just in time to see the doors to his derelict conversion van silently shut. He ran back to the backyard and went inside his home and called the police to tell them what he had seen. The police arrived and approached cold, i.e., without light sirens. And when they approached the van, the doors swung open and a bunch of people ran out in every direction. Upon searching the van, the cops found syringes and paraphernalia and determined that people were shooting up in there.
Yikes! What relief for that man to know he wasn't going crazy, though.
Dirty Mike and the boys strike again.
That was scary until the last sentence.
Japanese war crimes in WW2. That is my real answer, but it does remind me of that movie with Paul Rudd, where they're talking about scary stories around the campfire, and he says something like, "Everyday children like you are kidnapped and sold into child sex trafficking rings."
Role Models, the Paul Rudd movie, not the dude too Japanese.
My great-uncle was captured by the Japanese. He never really talked about it, except for one night when he had a drink and told my dad and granddad that they'd just decapitate people all the time. That's about all he ever said on the subject, but it clearly deeply affected him for the rest of his life.
I feel like the Japanese war crimes of WW2 are not as well known as they should be.
This may just horrify me more than others. /WW/NMyDailyNews.com/News National Cooked Man Found Cooked Death Tuna Factory Article 1-1/Man Found Cooked Tuna Factory Article 1 Dude was working on a tuna steamer, and they closed him in and steamed him. I can't help but imagine that as anything but a truly terrifying and painful way to die. One of the main reasons I never could bring myself to do real factory labor is because I don't trust people enough to not tuna steam me. Thanks for the gold. Rip Jose Melena.
It's insane how little I see maintenance using proper lockout-tagout procedure. A few months ago, a guy in maintenance was putting in new poles to mark where forklifts couldn't go, since some guys were driving them way too close to the offices for whatever reason. Apparently, one of the welders on our shop truck wasn't grounded properly, so when someone would weld, the entire fucking cart was hot. Now, up until this point, the perfect circumstance to complete the circuit to cause electrocution hadn't been met. Well, that ended that day. He was welding a plate to the pole and managed to be touching the cart and the pole at the same time, and was being electrocuted with, I believe, 480 plus volts. Luckily, another mechanic was there and kicked him out of the loop and saved his life. This cart has been unsafe like that for years, and nobody knew until that guy found out the hard way. A few months ago, I have way too many stories like this from my years in production facilities. How the last company I worked for is still up and running. I have no fucking clue. They bought their way out of a lot of trouble. I know that.
One of my friend's dad died because he was wearing gloves where he wasn't meant to in a factory. He was working on a sheet metal assembly line. The machine he was working would draw out a sheet to make it thinner, and it would spool into a big coil. His job had something to do with visually examining and adjusting the alignment of metal sheets by hand that were zipping by. If there was a burr on the edge, he had to trim it. Or if the metal was going off course, then he would realign it so it went straight. He had a brake that would slow the metal going past. The brake could stop the sheet movement, but slowing down was more efficient. And anyone who has worked in a factory knows that efficiency is king. You were not meant to wear gloves doing this job because they could get caught in the metal. You were just meant to put up with the cuts. My friend's dad got sick of getting cut, wore some gloves against OH&S, and got stuck on a burr. The production line sped up again, and zip, he was gone. There was no autopsy to do because he was just a big red smear inside a massive roll of sheet metal. I'm not a machinist, so I probably got some terms wrong, and hopefully you get the gist.
A guy I worked with was riding his dirt bike through the woods, and somebody hung a cable between two trees. My buddy caught his throat on it and saw the dude steal his dirt bike, woke up in the hospital with a lacerated throat and a broken larynx. Pretty crazy what somebody will do for something so cheap.
Dude is lucky he didn't get decapitated.
I hear way too many stories about people being decapitated by wires and stuff tied up at neck level. It's crazy to think that this is such a relatively common thing.
My mom's cousin died that way. He and his brothers were snowmobiling through rural Iowa, and they came across some barbed wire. It cut his head clean off. Nobody saw it, and he was the first one to hit it. The others managed to avoid it, but still had to deal with the mess. It was back in the 80s, so nobody had cell phones. They had to go to the nearest farmhouse to call 911.
I worked for U-Haul when I was 18, and it was located in front of a club that was known for being really sketchy. I came in to open one morning, and it was common for people to knock on the door, hoping to get in early and get their truck. On this day, I hear frantic knocking on the door. I'm there alone, still, so it kind of startled me. I look, and there's a woman, completely naked, covered in what looks like blood. I called the cops and grabbed one of the moving blankets and went outside to cover her up. She smelled really bad and was a mess. Ended up being blood and her own shit she was covered in. Found out later, she was drugged at the club that night, early morning, raped and left blacked out in the alley. It was just a fucked up and surreal situation to be involved in.
What a nightmare. I'm glad you could help.
This happened outside a vintage shop I used to work for in a college town in Florida. I came to open the next morning and had my coworker, who had happened to come in early, tell me that she found a college student the same age as me at the time, laying outside the door wrapped in a dirty blanket naked. She had been held captive in a house owned by a man a few blocks away for 2 days. It was never on the news or anything, so I only know because my coworker was the one to call the police. There were a lot of other disturbing rumors about the man in that house. Before and after this incident, I don't doubt some of them are unfortunately true.
Gee, fuck this planet and everyone on it, man. Jesus Christ.
During WEF 2, an American airplane crashed near the Japanese island of Chichijima. There were 9 servicemen on board. 1 was rescued by an American submarine. The other 8 were taken in by the Japanese. Don't want to go into all the details, but through some time and events, the Japanese ended up eating those servicemen. But that's not the weird part. The one serviceman who was rescued, that was George H. W. Bush. Google Chichijima incident for more details if you'd like. Yep.
The Japanese ended up eating those servicemen. But that's not the weird part. No, that's definitely the weird part.
No, thank you. This thread has already given me enough nightmare fuel.
Damn, the Japanese were insane during WU2.
A headless, limbless torso was found in the bushes at the rest stop in the town where I grew up. They never found the rest of her body parts or the murderer. She wasn't even identified until about a decade later. She was a prostitute that had been estranged from her family. My mom's theory is that a truck driver from out of state did it, dismembered her, dumped her torso at the rest stop, and scattered the rest of her over state lines. Could have been an isolated incident, or it could be a serial killer. We might not ever know. Idat, here's a news article on it if any of you are interested. Right city torso tam/local/crom/headless torso at founds headless/torso found at I rest stop identified by 54 flash article 6 5AC 2B166 C9506223B HTML.
This is going to make this even creepier. There is a gas station in Odessa, Delaware, and kinda across from it is a small wooded area. Just down the road is a state police troop. So back in the 90s, I used to hit up this gas station every day on my way to and from work. 1 hour commute each way. One day, I went to work, stopped. It was raining, and I had to park a bit from the store part and walk in. I got a flat and didn't realize it, but when I was pulling out, some guy told me about the flat, and to follow him. I told him no. I turned around and went back to the gas station and called my dad and waited in the station. Now here is the creepy part. A few months later, they found a woman's torso in the woods across the way. They have never, ever ID'd her. She was even featured on one of the last episodes of America's Most Wanted. I could have been her. I think about it from time to time. If I had accepted help from this random guy, did he puncture my tire on purpose? All that stuff.
Most likely a serial killer. The FBI even started the Highway Serial Killings Initiative, /archives, FBI gov/archives, news stories, 2009/highway serial, row 40609, because they believe a group of long-haul truckers are really serial killers.
I had a really crazy run-in with a trucker with my family on the way back from Canada. My aunt went out for a cigarette at a truck stop. The rest of the car went to the bathroom. I stayed in. The guy was just staring when we pulled up. No one really noticed. Once they left, he came over, asked for a cigarette, and got real weird with my aunt. I walked out the car. He got real weird, stared me down, and then left. I walked back to in the car, and he came back as my mom was by herself walking back to the car. He headed towards her, and I yelled, "Get the fuck in the car." He ran. We sped away, and he was banging on the car. He ran with us to the highway.
I was in a crappy motel. The room had bed bugs. I was too exhausted to go to the front desk. I just needed to make it until the morning. I slept in the tub. Hours later, I hear someone breaking through the window. I had a big knife with me and ran out into the room to find a man halfway through my window. We stared for a while at each other in shock. I think we both were scared. Then he says, "Is this your room?" I'm like, "Yes, this is my room, man." More staring. Then he slowly starts backing out while cursing me for leaving my window unlocked and not expecting him to break in. Motel on Watt Ave, Sacramento.
In a thread full of stories making me question why I'm even here. Yours has some comical value, at least while I understand it might have been traumatic for you. This part, we stared for a while at each other in shock. I think we both were scared. Then he says, "Is this your room?" I'm like, "Yes, this is my room, man." More staring. Then he slowly starts backing out while cursing me for leaving my window unlocked and not expecting him to break in. Just makes me laugh so much for some reason.
Fuck Watt Ave. I used to live near there. Get to!
Well, an open window is literally an invitation to come in and have a good time.
On May 31st, 2014, two 12-year-old girls lured their friend into the woods and brutally stabbed her in an attempt to summon or appease Slenderman, a fictional internet villain who is said to inhabit wooded areas and stalk his victims among the trees. Wikipedia.org/wiki Slenderman stabbing.
This one is especially stupid, since none of the Slenderman mythos involves people worshipping him or sacrificing for him. He's just a creepy long dude in the woods.
There was a Law and Order episode about this event.
I've posted this before, but mine. When I was a baby, my dad played on a softball team. Typical social team. out for beers and pizza after with the guys. Family event type thing. My parents were good friends with two of the other couples. Both of them had young kids as well. On this occasion, the other two couples had left their kids at one of their houses. With a babysitter they were splitting. They invited my parents back to the house to have some more beers that night. But I was being fussy, and my mom nixed the idea, though they would 100% have normally gone back to hang out. Well, it turned out my fussiness on that day saved our lives. When the other parents got back to the house, they walked in on a home invasion. Two men had broken in, tied up the kids and the babysitter and her boyfriend, and were waiting for the parents. Took the parents hostage as well, and made the dads drive with them to bank/a grocery store, where one dad was manager and clear out accounts, a safe. They then came back to the house and slaughtered both families, the babysitter and her boyfriend, kids included. They caught the two guys later on. My dad attended the trials and said it was the first time he had ever had thoughts of supporting the death penalty. It still gives me chills to know how close we came to getting killed that day, too. Edit. Wow, you guys are amazing detectives. I have been telling this story for years, and this is the first time I have been made aware that it wasn't me as a baby. It was my sister, 9 years older, born in '72. My dad has been telling me this story wrong for as long as I can remember. Sorry for the confusion, all.
Got an article on this, but fuck!
This thread makes me want to buy a softball bat to hide under my bed. Then I look at my 120B's Cane Corso and feel safe every night when I sleep.
Wait, they both left with the dads and left the family at the house unattended? If so, then the movies really downplay how hard it is to get free once tied up by someone.
A pub in Colnbrook, Berkshire, in UK, has a pretty terrifying history. The ostrich has seen its fair share of murders, and they say that over 60 were committed here. Most famous of all were those committed in the 17th century by the landlord of the time, Jarman, who with his wife made a very profitable sideline by murdering their guests after they had retired for the night. They had a trapdoor built into the floor of one of their bedrooms, and when a suitably rich candidate arrived, Jarman would inform his wife that a fat pig was available if she wanted one. She would reply by asking her husband to put him in the sty for till the morrow. The bedstead was hinged, and they would tip the sleeping victim into a vat of boiling liquid immediately below, thus killing him. The article www. The Ostrich Colnbrook UK history. The Ostrich Colnbrook co UK/history. /quarter www both bar u/content /articles 2000 ostrich tributes /co ostrich co kent articles /brawlfish ostrich feature.
I've actually eaten at that pub with my karate class when we went to the Windsor seminar. Doesn't feel weird or anything. At least it didn't when we went in.
Is this where the idea of the characters making meat pies out of guests in Sweeney Todd came from?
Oh, that reminds me of the Bloody Benders. The Benders operated a sort of bed and breakfast in La Boette, Kansas in 1871. They would take in overnight guests, kill them, and steal their belongings. It is believed they killed more than a dozen people in this way before escaping, never to be brought to justice. The Bloody Benders, Wikipedia, org/wiki/bloodybenders.
The case of Elizabeth Smart, Wikipedia, org/wiki, kidnapping of Elizabeth Smart. She was kidnapped, repeatedly raped, psychologically tortured, and then brought around in plain sight in heavy religious garb. She had brushes with people who could have helped her, but her kidnapper claimed she wasn't allowed to speak in public or reveal her face for religious reasons. The reason she was rescued is because her sister was awake during her kidnapping and pretended to be asleep. She knew she recognized the voice, but it took her 9 months to remember. It was a guy that used to do yard work for the family. The police didn't believe her because of the elapsed time, but pursued it to appease the family.
What pisses me off about this story is the fact that Wanda Bazi is out of jail as we speak and is on probation. She should be in prison for the rest of her life, just like the kidnapper. Elizabeth even said she was the most evil woman she has ever met. There are drug dealers spending more jail time than Wanda.
This story still haunts me to this day. I was just talking about it the other day to someone, and citing it as a reason to have a security system in place and armed even when you are home and in bed. She was taken out of her own bed in the middle of the night. Can you imagine how her parents felt? I used to live in Orem, UT, 45 minutes south of Salt Lake City, and I was young when it happened. I remember Avril Lavigne's I'm With You playing on the radio with news clips and voice clips about her edited into the song. I don't know about anywhere else, but it was a huge deal in Utah and the talk of the town until she was found, and even for a while after. I was wondering if I'd see this story mentioned, considering the other kinds of content in this thread.
I just went down this rabbit hole last night. As awful as it is, it's amazing that she kept her wits about her, knew what she had to do to stay alive, and has moved on as a news correspondent, activist, and mother of 3. I can't even imagine going through that at such a young age and doing anything but hiding the rest of my life.
One night about 2 years ago, I believe it was spring, and it was about 9 or 10 at night. A bit of context. My mother is a photographer, and she has one of those big, expensive cameras. Now, I was just sitting in my room playing Xbox with my buddies, and I heard the commotion of my family in the doorway to the backyard, the kind of commotion of people gawking. So I went out to see what it was all about. I go to my dad and ask what it is, and he says there's something in our backyard, and my mom is out there trying to get pictures, but her flash isn't working, and she's right at the fence trying to get pictures, and all of a sudden the flash goes off and lights up the pitch black yard, and right in front of my mom is a bear stood up on its back legs, just standing there. By the time the flash was done, my mom was nearly in the house.
This reminds me of a story I was told by a biologist studying jaguars. Back in the days of film cameras, she had set up a motion control still camera in a cave, hoping to catch a pic of the elusive jaguar in that area. When she finally developed the role, she got one photo of a startled armadillo. 22 more photos of said armadillo, really enjoying the motion-controlled flash, and the last photo was of nothing but a jaguar's glowing eyes. Because the snap-happy armadillo had killed the flash batteries with all his selfies.
Was it a good pic, though?
Probably scared the shit out of that poor bear.
H. Holmes and the hotel he built specifically to murder people, like something from a horror movie but completely true. APN Wikipedia org/H. Holmes dov equals SFTI1.
There was a good sci-fi time travel series called Timeless, which featured an episode where the main characters go back in time to the World's Fair in Chicago, and they wind up trapped in Holmes's murder hotel.
The Devil in the White City is an incredible book about this and the Chicago World's Fair. They are making it into a movie/show for Hulu.
If anyone here has watched American Horror Story, this is the hotel that Hotel Cortez from season 5 is based off of.
Every year, thousands of children go missing all over the world, and at most, you hear about a few per year in your area. Noon seems to care. It is literally a nuisance to many to have a "Have you seen my child?" ad pop up on their social media.
There was an article I saw recently, in Canada I think, where there was huge petition to start fining people. Their offence, 911, or whatever they are called there, were receiving a large amount of calls from people angry that their phone was going off at like 2 in the morning for an Amber Alert. I cannot wrap my mind around calling 911, getting an emergency dispatcher to complain about a sound. And on top of that, it ties them up from other calls, which is the reason for the fine. Edit. While I stand by my stance of don't call 911 to complain, I have since learned that you cannot disable these alerts. So I'm more understanding of the issue, but not of how people are responding to it.
I wonder how many are missing due to their parents?
That is scary, but this is scarier and sadder to me. How many go missing that no one ever reports missing, that no one ever claims or knows about? Like this little girl who was found dead in Opelika, AL, but there appears to be no record of her existence prior to discovery of her body. How many bocalis/new/news/test result reveals new clue in Opelika Kajendo mystery? R-store ED 51186 A9211241858 HTML.
Holy fuck, so he was calm throughout that shit?
Wow, Didn't see that coming.
The Battle of Oswiec Fortress, 1915. German troops attempted to gas the Russian defenders out, as the fort had been a thorn in the side of the Germans since the outbreak of war. The gas succeeded in killing almost 3 whole companies. The Germans then advanced across the fields, expecting the fortress to be empty and an easy victory. From within the fortress, Russian troops emerged, coughing up blood and lung fragments, covered in bandages made up as improvised gas masks, as well as chemical burns. They returned rifle and light artillery fire at the advancing Germans. The German troops didn't bother firing back, as they just ran back to their lines. Their commanders claimed, "They're already dead. Give it 20 minutes and go take the place." To which the soldiers remarked, "It is not men protecting that place, but the devil." Oswiec Fortress never fell during the war, as when the German troops went back months after there was already fresh defenders. I know this story is much different to the ones other people have said, but it's the one I could think of as truly terrifying.
Ah, the good old attack of the dead men.
Leave it to the Russians to come back from the brink of death to defend.
Osowiec then, and again charge of the dead 100 men?
Well, I'm a bit late and I'm not sure if anyone posted this already, but the story of Hisashi Uchi. He suffered radiation exposure so thorough his DNA was destroyed, and he probably would have died in a matter of days or even hours. But doctors kept him alive for almost 3 months. He was conscious and begging for death as his body literally fell apart. YouTube watch. Here's a video about it, but be warned, it is very disturbing and graphic.
Yo him straight up, not having a good time.
The Donner Party, a group of American pioneers that had to resort to cannibalism to survive being stranded in the Sierra Nevada. In Wikipedia, org/wik/Donner Party.
I recently did a research project on the Donner Party Forlorn Hope, and it was intense to read about. Honestly though, the scariest part of that story is Kesselberg's at the very end of the relief parties. Had a boiling pot of human flesh on the fire when the rescuers found him.
The crazy thing is, they didn't even have to resort to cannibalism. Members of the local native population actually tried to leave them food and help, but they shot at them and chased them off. You can sort of understand why at first, given that these were settlers who were terrified by stories of violence. But if someone shows up leaving food for you and you're starving, maybe apply some critical thinking before you eat little Josephine's leg. IDK. Update for the reading impaired. It's almost like I already said, it was understandable why they were frightened by the natives and unwilling to accept their help, lol. You can see who got one sentence in and then rushed to add their reply before reading the rest.
Yeah, this one is crazy. Last podcast on the left does a really good job covering this one.
It happened to my mom's friend a couple of years back. She was driving on the highway in the middle of nowhere, as in far away from any town. Suddenly, a car that is passing on her left steers fully to the right in front of her, causing her to brake and steer very rashly. This obviously causes her to lose control and crash against a tree. She passed out, and sometime later, she couldn't really tell how much time passed. A group of Brazilians, all of this happened in Portugal, came to her rescue and told her things like, "Don't move, we're calling an ambulance, just hang on there," etc. She eventually passes out again, and about 2 hours later, someone else comes and starts helping her again. And eventually, the ambulance and her husband arrive. She tells them that some other people have been there before, but the guy that found her says no one was there. When they checked the trunk, everything had been stolen, including computer, camera, etc. She later said that she remembers thinking the car that made her crash had been following her for a while and driving a little too close. Make of that what you want. Sorry for my English.
Sorry for my English. Your English is very good.
This one actually scares me with how people drive sometimes. I was driving home, a friend lives in the next county over, about a 30-minute drive on a major highway, but it was like 1 a.m. It's a stretch of the highway that goes over a few small mountains, so it's just very empty at this hour. about out halfway home. Out of nowhere, it seemed this car just flew up on me and was riding my ass and everything. I drive in the far right lane and go a little over the speed limit. My friends say I drive like a grandma. I know I didn't cut this person off or anything. I DK why they were on my ass. They wouldn't pass me. The speed limit was 70 and I slowed down to 20 to get them to go around. Nothing worked. Great, I thought. I was getting to town and realized, well shit, I don't want them following me home. So I picked an exit that had a large patch of grass. Almost like a field, but not really. Just a grassy area. Anyways, I go down the exit and right as the guardrail started coming up, I jerked into the grass and drove through it back onto the highway. I drive a Jeep and the car was a little sedan. I flew down to the next exit. Went down a few lights where there was a long stretch of a Jersey wall between oncoming lanes of traffic. I did a U-turn as fast as I could and booked it back down the road. I saw the car on the other side of the Jersey wall as I was going the opposite direction as them. Now I made it to a gas station that always had cops at it. It was their go-to place for coffee, I guess. That person never caught up to me or found me. Thank God. IDK what I would have done or what they were thinking of doing to me.
I thought this was going to be a wholesome story about guardian angels that saved her life somehow and disappeared. Nope.
Last week, I would have said the Japanese war crimes or the rape of Nanking. But frankly, for me, it's the fact that absolutely nothing is going to come of the Jeffrey Epstein arrest and connections, that some of the most influential people on Earth are totally and visibly able to manipulate the system to cover the fact that they're rapists, pedophiles, and murderers.
This outlook makes me sad, especially because I feel so powerless to do anything.
My question is, why are so many political figures so fucked up?
I would call it creepy more than scary, but my mom's friend had a small house and lived alone. She noticed weird things. A batch of soup depleting faster than usual, missing eggs, damp towels in the hamper when she hadn't used any, extra dishes in the dishwasher, etc. This went on for months. She thought she was just being forgetful. One day she heard some thumping around in her attic and went to investigate. She found some makeshift living quarters, small radio, hot plate, sleeping bag, pillow, food wrappers, etc. She called the cops who came to keep an eye on the place. They ended up catching a homeless man climbing a tree, trying to sneak into her attic window. He had been doing this almost daily. He would wait for her to go to work, then go downstairs and help himself to food and amenities. The funny part about this story is they got to know each other throughout the ordeal. And the guy was actually very respectful, just down on his luck. She didn't press charges. Instead, let him move in, helped him get a job, and he lived in the attic until he got back on his feet. Creepy shit with a happy ending.
Damp towels in the hamper when she hadn't used any, extra dishes in the dishwasher. And that's when she knew she'd found a keeper housemate.
Wow, what an amazingly kind lady. I hope good karma came back and hugged her with big arms.
Right, new Reddit burst slat it com// you fell for it fool / comments you fell for it fool / you source you share in Medium iOS app.
Personally, when I was detained by the Nicaraguan military while filming a documentary abroad, I seriously thought we were done for because they had our teams separated and we mixed our stories up. My legs were sharking. The main officer guy was a full-fledged Bond villain too. He had a jet black mustache, sunglasses, and a golden canine tooth. He spoke broken English, so when he told us he could go, it sounded sarcastic and that we were going to be mowed down in the ditch as we left in our bus. It was an insane story. So do, YouTube, watch, edit. Thanks for the gold. My first ever. Cheers, friend.
This needs upvotes. So many stories that aren't personal or second-hand accounts. Just people talking about stuff from history / the news.
My legs were sharking. That does sound severe.
Did you finish / get to finish your original documentary? That experience sounds like fresh out of a movie scene. Holy crap.
My long-term partner decided to end his life suddenly and unexpectedly a few years ago. He was the happiest person I knew, and even with 20/20 hindsight, videos, pouring through old messages, etc., I wouldn't be able to identify any warning signs.
My sister just did the same on 7/9/19. No one had any idea. It's completely baffling. It's shaken me to the core.
I'm sorry that happened to you.
Sometimes people with chronic depression do all they can to be happy for the people around them because they don't want anyone to feel how they feel. They don't want people to be upset or angry, so they smile instead. He probably wasn't happy. He was probably very, very sad for a very long time.
My friend's boss bought an Audi A4 convertible back when they were new and interesting. One of the talking points was the pop-up roll hoops that were hidden unless you rolled it. A few months after buying it, he got to test those roll hoops out as he lost control and skidded down a steep bank about 10 meters but 35 feet deep. The roll hoops did their job, and he survived with just cuts and scratches from the bushes he'd plowed through. The car ended up the right way up, and he got out, walked back up the bank to the side of the road, then got on the phone to the police to report the accident. While he was standing there, a driver from a car that had seen the accident came over to speak to him. Approaching from behind, the other driver asked if he was okay. My friend's boss turned around to reply and dropped dead. His neck had been fractured, but was in one piece, right up until he turned his head, when it severed his spinal cord.
Fairly common to break your neck and not realize, apparently.
Had an old-timer cop tell me about something like that from when he was younger. Dude crashed on the highway and was walking around fine and was leaned up against the ambulance holding his neck, saying that it was sore, but he didn't want any treatment. And when everyone heard someone hit the ground, they turned around and saw the dude dead with a broken neck, just like you described.
My mom didn't tell me this story for the longest time. I think just so she wouldn't unnecessarily worry me when I was younger. But my parents split up when I was about 4 years old, and my mom and my sisters stayed in a small townhouse for a few years before moving in with my stepdad. Anyway, while we were at the townhouse for I think less than a year, my mom heard something in her room in the middle of the night, and when she woke up to go look, there was a man in her room. She audibly gasped and got out of bed, either to fight or run to our room. She couldn't really decide, because she was pumped full of adrenaline. The guy ended up running out of our back door, and when the police came, they found signs of forced entry. She never told any of us the full story, because we were still sound asleep the entire time, but she ended up explaining more of it the older we got. Eat it. Sorry for not explaining more. A lot of people have asked me to finish the story, so here goes. We never found out who it was. The police weren't able to either. Their best guess was that he broke in to rob the place. God forbid he wanted to do anything else, and was just as surprised to see my mom as she was to see him. They think that he thought the place was empty, and it would be an easy mark, and bailed when he came face to face with the owner.
Did you ever got to know who the man was?
Well, what was the full story? Was that it?
That's so freaking scary. I think something similar happened when I was a kid. We lived in this trashy, shitty trailer in Tucson before my dad finished grad school. My sister's bedroom was by the back door that my parents had put a knife in the lock thing, so it was reasonable to assume that no one could enter the house through the back door. One night, my sister and I were hanging out in her bedroom with the door closed. We heard a loud crash from the back door and some footsteps and rummaging in the bathroom across the hall from the door. It was only like 30 seconds, and then the door slammed shut. My sister and I were just sitting there, completely terrified and too scared to say anything or move. After a few minutes, we cracked the door and peeked into the hallway. The knife was on the floor, and when we went into the bathroom, the cabinet and all the drawers were open. My dad really told us it was our cat. IDK why he never called the police or anything, but it was an isolated incident.
From when I was delivering pizza, I walked up to a trailer park house and knocked. Dude answers the door wearing a swastika armband and he's bald. I tell him the total, and he invites me inside while he gets the money. There's 10 more dudes, all bald, all wearing armbands, sitting in a circle in metal chairs. Guy gives me the money. I go to leave. He grabs my arm and gets in my face and asks, "Do you like mkurs?" I don't want to be murdered. So I respond, "Nope, not at all, hate those fuckers," and leave as quick as possible. The scary part is, every other delivery driver but me that night was black, and they might have never been seen again if I didn't take the delivery.
Holy fuck. Do you still go into people's houses? Or do you just stand outside now?
I swear I've read this before somewhere.
Before my dad died, he once told me a story from when he was in Vietnam in the 1960s. He told me about a mission where he and one other American, with 5 CIDG strikers, South Vietnamese villagers turned fighters, were tasked to emplace seismic ground sensors along a trail network deep in the jungle. He said they were about 2 days into the mission when he and 2 of the strikers split off from the main group to go watch a nearby trail intersection. He said the jungle was pretty quiet that day, just the sounds of birds and bugs and an occasional monkey. He said they had been watching the trail intersection for about 3 or 4 hours and were deciding on whether to move further down the trail or to turn back and link up with the rest of the patrol. Before leaving the cover of the brush, my dad said he checked the trail ahead of them one last time and prepared his men to move. Now here is where the story gets interesting, and he told this part with absolute dead seriousness. He said, just as he started to step out onto the trail, he sees a light-skinned black Union cavalry soldier in full battle gear laying alongside the trail just shy of the intersection. My dad said the Union soldier had 2 pistols, a Spencer rifle, and a short curved club at his hip. As my dad was trying to process what he was seeing, the soldier looked directly at him and smiled. Then the soldier slowly placed a finger up to his lips as if to tell him to be silent, and then motioned my dad back off the trail. My dad said he signaled for his men to remain hidden, and he recalled that as he slipped back into the jungle on one side of the trail, the Union soldier did the same on his side of the trail. Less than 10 seconds later, he said the lead element of a group of NVA, North Vietnamese Army soldiers, walked right through the trail intersection, some 30 feet away. My dad estimated that the group was comprised of some 70 to 80 soldiers, equipped with automatic rifles, light machine guns, and rocket-propelled grenade launchers. He has no doubt that his entire team would have been wiped out on the spot. He said as soon as the enemy soldiers had passed, he and his team beat feet out of there as fast and as quietly as they could and rejoined with the rest of the patrol. He reported the enemy soldiers his team had encountered, but decided not to say anything about the soldier he had seen. My dad kept this secret for many, many years, only telling me just before he passed, and earlier only telling his grandmother on her deathbed in the 1970s. He said when he told his grandmother, she smiled and without opening her eyes told him, "You saw old Red Tom." Red Tom was my great-great-grandfather. He was a half-black, half-Creek free man who was a scout for the Union Army during the Civil War and later served with the U.S. Cavalry in the American West. He was known for carrying 2 pistols, a Spencer rifle, and a Creek war club into battle.
That is one of the most interesting, as opposed to horrifying, stories I've seen in this thread. Thank you for sharing.
In a thread that's full of so much darkness, this story really is the light that shines brightly.
Love this. And how sweet for your grandma to hear about her grandpa watching over her son on her deathbed.
I made the mistake of reading about the Anthill Kids cult at night. I don't recommend it. Here's the article I read. Threngpfpnl/www.cvlnation.com/anthill-kids break legs sledgehammer go hell/. Don't read it while you're eating. Starts of like a typical hippie apocalypse type cult, ends with a lot of mutilation and murder. Edit. Link seems to be getting the Reddit hug. Just Google the Anthill Kids. There have been a lot of write-ups about it.
However, Theriot's pièce de résistance came when one of his followers complained of pain in the abdomen. Theriot forced her to undress, laid her on the kitchen table, punched her in the stomach, performed an enema by shoving a tube up her rectum, and filled her up with olive oil. Then he cut her stomach open, ripped out parts of her intestines with his bare hands, and he forced another member to stitch her up. Then he shoved a tube down her throat and made the other women blow air into it. Unsurprisingly, the woman died the next day. Of course, Theriot as a prophet had the powers of resurrection. This resurrection consisted of drilling a hole in the dead woman's skull and having every male member ejaculate into it. The woman remained dead. The woman remained dead.
In 2011, Roch Moses Theriot's cellmate walked up to the guard station, handed them a knife, and said, "That piece of shit is down on the range. Here's the knife. I've sliced him up." Honestly, an appropriate reaction.
Not gonna dare reading it, but I'm just looking at the link like, holy fuck. Anthill, kids break legs, sledgehammer go hell. I don't want any part of this.
Old janitor from high school, friendly Ecuadorian man who went by Ping, worked at the school for 20 plus years and nobody had a problem with him. I guess his wife was leaving him, and in the process of moving out, he caught her in bed with her new man. Next day, in the middle of town, he opened fire on her, the man, and then killed himself before any cops had time to respond.
Similar story here. I worked at Office Depot as a tech manager for a few years. One guy who lived in the neighborhood came almost every day to buy CD sleeves for his bootleg DVDs, which he was selling on the side. He was cool, came in, chatted a bit, sometimes did some stuff at the print center, paid for his stuff and left. About a year into my time there, he stopped coming in. None of us had seen him for like 2 weeks. So one of the employees did a quick Google search. Turns out he shot and killed his girlfriend, and then killed himself. It was wild. Here's the story. Here's like you, Fox19com, /story 2658723. Police man wanted for Bond Hill murder found with self-inflicted gunshot wound in Spring Grove, Everton. Fox Snortery 2653 / police man wanted for Bond Hill murder found with self-inflicted gunshot wound.
My uncle did the same thing to my aunt, and the guy he thought she was having the affair with. It was at the mall where she worked during broad daylight. He walked out almost unnoticed. My uncle committed suicide the night after. Cops found him in his car a couple days later, ready for war with guns, grenades, you name it. Saddest part to me, other than the fact that their 3-year-old son was now an orphan, the guy he thought she was having an affair with was just her gay friend. That was a good listener and a supportive friend. I was 9, I'm 30 now, and that situation still breaks my heart.
Stories like this break my heart. We have no idea what kind of home life the guy had, whether the wife was abusive, if he was abusive, if they'd just grown apart. He didn't open fire on her because she was cheating. It was just the last straw.
A woman named Joyce Vincent died alone in her bedsit/apartment in London and wasn't found for 2 years. She was only discovered because bailiffs came to evict her from the property and instead found her decomposed body in half-skeleton form. The TV had been on and the windows had been open for 2 years. Despite the smell and the noise emanating from the apartment, no one had come sooner and found her. Because of the state her body was found in, they could only identify her through matching her teeth to a photograph of her smiling. Because there was basically no body left to study, no one knows how she passed. Her friends guess it was anything from murder to an asthma attack, but no one can ever know. It's not the most scary story in terms of its gruesomeness. Some tales in this thread have made me nauseous. But to think someone can die alone and not be found by their family or friends for so long, especially in such a densely populated city, fucking terrifies me. More info here. All that's interesting, /Vincent. Amazing, trailered documentary about Joyce here. How would you, YouTube/video, YouTube comms watch VV4. Do watch the whole thing if you can.
Her friends were mentioned in the story, so if they were here friends, why did they not check up on her in those 2 years?
This reminds me of something I read once about a woman who died in Yugoslavia in the 1960s or 70s, and her body wasn't found until the 2000s or thereabouts when someone finally entered her apartment.
A bunch of girls in my friend group decided to have a night out and ended up at the local gay club. I can't remember why I didn't go, but I'm sort of glad I wasn't there. However, I also wish I had been so I could have helped. Anyway, they noticed a girl on the dance floor who looked super out of place. She had sweatpants and a t-shirt on and wasn't wearing makeup and had her hair in a ponytail. She also had a backpack on. Basically, the exact opposite of typical club attire, and not at all what someone would usually wear to this place. They said that she seemed very dazed as well, and more importantly, there was a very large man grabbing her and grinding on her. And she was just kind of standing there, letting it happen. One of my friends tried approaching her to ask if she was all right, but the guy spoke for her and insisted that he was her boyfriend and that she just had too much to drink, but that she was okay. Everyone was suspicious, but at that point there wasn't much else they could do, so they just kept an eye on the two of them. Eventually, the guy left the dance floor to go to the bar, and my friend was able to talk to this girl again. She said that she was extremely out of it, and that it seemed more likely that she had been drugged rather than just drunk. The girl managed to convey that she didn't know the man she was with and wanted to leave. So my friend grabbed her and made for the exit, but not before this guy came back. He immediately flipped out, got right in my friend's face and started screaming at her. It escalated to the point that he eventually swung at my friend, who just barely dodged the punch. Thankfully, someone else had went and found a security guard, and they were able to prevent this guy from hurting anyone, meaning that my friends and the girl were all able to leave safely. She was still super messed up when they left, so nobody could get the full story out of her, but she did say that the guy had been following her around town all day. The really scary part is that the bar staff couldn't technically do anything other than throw this guy out after my friends had left. One of them called the cops and gave them a description of the guy, but they said they couldn't really do much other than be on the lookout for him. So chances are that he's still out there somewhere and may do this again.
The really scary part is that the bar staff couldn't technically do anything other than throw this guy out after my friends had left. Forgive my ignorance, but the guy tried to drug someone. Why couldn't the bar staff keep him there till the police arrived?
I remember having to do something like this, and I'm still quite proud of myself to this day for it. Bearing in mind, I was a skinny-ass small woman with serious confrontation phobia. I was in the smoking area of a pub one night waiting for friends. At one side of the smoke garden, there was a couple whispering to each other. After a few mins, it became quite clear she was very uncomfortable and wanted to leave. She went to walk away a few times, and he grabbed her elbow and pulled her back. There were a good few people in this smoking area, and no one fucking did a thing, and I got so worked up and annoyed for her. Anyway, she went to walk away again and start saying louder, "Stay the fuck away from me," and breaking his grasp. I got up, pretended to know her, and asked how she was doing and if she was okay. He got super pissy and asked me to leave, saying, "They were talking." And I looked him in the face, and no, it's fairly evident she's done talking to you, and you need to leave now. He stormed off, and she was quite thankful and explained the situation to me. It turned out to be some dude she dated a few times, and just wasn't taking it well that she wasn't interested anymore. Anyway, I saw him again a while later in the pub, and he was too drunk and fairly aggro looking for a fight, so I went to the bouncers and got him kicked out. Seriously, if you see something untoward and your gut is telling you something is wrong, do something. Even if it's grabbing a bouncer or calling the police, you are not wasting their time.
And may do this again. We'll do this again. They don't start out following and drugging women. This is a ritual.
My mom was driving, and a guy ran out in the road, so she stopped so she couldn't hit him. It was nighttime, so it was pretty dark out, and 3 other men emerged from the forest around, all trying to use the door handles of her car to get in. She locked them, luckily, and gassed it to the nearest town. Remember to always lock your car after you start it, because if it wasn't unlocked, who knows what would have happened to her.
Probably one of the many reasons newer cars auto-lock their doors once you go over 15 miles per hour.
I was in an affluent part of the city on a bright and beautiful day, stopped at a busy gas station, packed with people, filled up my tank, got in my car, and suddenly my passenger door opens and someone gets in. I thought it was a mistake until they said they weren't getting out and I was going to drive to my bank. I was a month shy of 21, and now I lock my doors immediately. No matter where I am, who I'm with, or what I'm doing.
And from an EMS point of view, it can take a long time to bust into a wrecked car with all its doors locked. I always disable auto lock for this reason.
Nisha per train disaster, en, Wikipedia, org/wiki, Nisha per train disaster, is something that reminds me how death can come at any moment. A train with 51 wagons of sulfur, fertilizer, petrol, and cotton wool somehow broke loose and rolled down the track about 20 kilometers until it derailed in the town of Khayyam, Iran. There were no humans on board. Chemical leaks ensued, and authorities tried to extinguish whatever fires broke out. At one point, the whole thing explodes, and it really explodes. The whole town of Khayyam is literally demolished. 3 nearby towns are badly damaged, and it was heard 70 kilometers away. The wreckage continued to explode for several days after. Around 300 people died, and more than that injured. An earthquake of 3.6 on Richter scale was produced.
I feel like this was intentional, not an accident. Why were so many extremely explosive and flammable materials stored together? How did the train travel 20 kilometers on its own without anyone noticing? And most importantly, how did it gain 50 meters in elevation over that distance?
3.6, not great, not terrible.
As someone who lives about a half mile from railroad tracks, thanks for this.
That there's a guy casing the bar that I work at literally right now, and I can't do anything to stop him. He's been in asking what time/days we're open and what days we have security. Caught him feeling the corners of our windows and doors too. Unfortunately, until he breaks in and robs us, the police won't do a thing.
I hope you took a picture of him.
Tell him you know he's casing the joint and that he should piss off. Because if the place gets robbed, you have his photos, even if you don't. I did this to someone casing the pub I worked at.
The bar is private property. You can kick him out and tell him not to come back. You don't need a reason, and it would be best not to supply one. If he doesn't leave, call the police, as he's trespassing.
I moved into another town. I was surprised by people who looked as they knew me, even though I saw them for the very first time. And everyone around was so rude, despite of all other sources telling how friendly people there were. I was also greeted by, "Oh no, you again," in one place where I went for the first time. I was looking for a room for rent, and one of the owners told me that he won't rent it to me because my co-tenants saw me following and stalking them. I was like, what the fuck? Am I doing things and forgetting? Is something wrong with my mental health? Then, I went abroad for 3 months. No such thing was happening there. Everything was normal. I thought, guess it's just a local culture. They do that to get rid of newcomers. Once I returned, I went to a fast food to leave my CV. The guy said, "You were here a month ago, and it hasn't changed. We aren't recruiting." Right, I was on another continent. I couldn't have just bought 2 airplane tickets, spent several days, and just forgetting about it. And my bank account wouldn't forget. Anyway, that's when I started to understand what's going on. And then one day, I finally saw myself on the CCTV, trying to steal something. Right? Stealing, following people and stalking, and being disliked makes sense. There was some thief who looked exactly like me, even had similar hairstyle, which was in fashion around. As of now, I already know of 2 guys who look identically like me.
They say everybody has 7 doppelgangers, and it seems like you're very good at finding them.
Dude, you're a clone.
We had a guy who looked like Ross from Friends steal a crate of beer in a shop in the UK. It went viral. Even David Schwimmer himself did a mock-up video. /BBC Co UK /AV4599728 /David Schwimmer - I didn't steal beer from Blackpool shop.
When my aunt was about 16, she was working at a grocery store and had a boss in his mid-20s. One day, he called the house and was begging her to sneak out and hang out with him. She was considering it because it was her boss, and she didn't want to say no. My mom, who is 2 years younger than her, always gets these incredibly spot-on gut feelings. She had one that night and begged my aunt not to go out with him. Thankfully, she listened to my mom and told him no, which made him really angry. He ended up going out that night and meeting another girl. He took her out to some cliffs and raped her and pushed her off. Somehow, she lived through this and was able to get him sent to prison. I feel so sorry for that girl and so thankful for my mom and her gut feelings. Always trust your gut.
So, a 20-something man wanted a 16-year-old girl, aka a minor, who was also one of his employees, to sneak out and hang out with him. I'd say no gut feelings required for that one. Dude is a creeper. Good job that your mom warned her sister. Smart girl.
My coworker told me a story. She was also 16 years and working at her first small job. Her boss was 40 or so and very nice, but she had a weird feeling about him and quiet that job. A few weeks later, the boss raped a 16-year-old girl and went to jail. She's always listening at her guts since then.
Gavin de Becker's The Gift of Fear is a great read to this tune.
I spent my first 10 years in New Delhi. Back then, we would find dead women, burnt with acid or set on fire, and it used to be so normal. Like, oh look, another one of those dowry cases where her family didn't pay the husband enough money, so they killed her. Many years later, I revisited those memories and realized how insane that actually was. I'd totally forgotten about all that.
The prolific fucked up stories from India that involve children, women, rape, and murder are way you could not give me enough money to step onto that subcontinent.
Would people be sad someone they love and know is dead or nobody cared? Like, would police be called and investigated?
My friend tripped and fell onto the tracks, landing his face onto the third rail. We kind of stood there in absolute shock because we thought he was dead, but then he said, "Can I move? Will I be electrocuted?" We told him to move instantly, and he did. We got him off the tracks, and no less than 2 minutes later, a train went zipping by. I think the third rail turned on, seconds after his face came off of it. I know that's not scary to a lot of people, but to me, it was because I would have lost a close friend back when I was about 12. But
The third rail is any city kid's nightmare. I would think about it constantly. It was one of my greatest sources of anxiety.
I had a cousin who died because he was playing on the train tracks. He and his friends were jumping trains. He ended up essentially getting cut in half. His mother wanted to use his death as a lesson to his friends, so she made the funeral open casket. I wasn't allowed to go, but my parents came home absolutely devastated. My mother said that the parents kept going up to the casket to put their son back together. Horrifying.
my cuckoo clock, that is broken for more than 20 years, made weird sounds 2 times in a row in the middle of the night.
My brother's Furby was reactivated after about 10 years, when my grandparents jostled the cabinet where it was stored. We screamed our heads off when we opened the door.
Like those Furbies that revive themselves with a guttural growl after years just to remind you they can never truly die.
Did it send you back in time to inhabit your younger body, each day getting younger by years, until you could fix the clock?
I used to run the boilers in a DOE building. Apparently, at some point in the 80s, 3 people were murdered over involvement in a big VCR theft. VCRs meant for the school system had apparently been stolen out of this warehouse. It was an inside job. Something went wrong. The head custodian was found shot to death, and later the bodies of the other 2 were reported buried in Monticello. But word is, they had first been incinerated. In the boilers, I was in charge of operating and maintaining. There were 3 operational boilers, and 1 that wasn't in service. No clue which one was supposedly used. But when you're firing them up, you're typically the only person in the building. Not a single day went by that I fired them up and didn't wonder which one was used. But that wasn't what gave me the real heebie-jeebies. You have to clean the interior of these boilers really well. Otherwise, the fire won't transfer heat to the water very efficiently. Especially with 6 oil, these boilers would build up a lot of soot. You have to suit up in a Tyvek suit, wear a mask, and climb right into the firebox. I found myself staring down the business end of that burner many times, wondering what that panic would feel like. I'm reasonably sure these people were dead before getting put in the boiler, though. Once, I was actually in one boiler while another one was running. The valve that isolated my boiler from the main steam line wasn't holding, and by the time I realized how warm it was getting, it was enough to panic, trying to lift myself up and belly crawl through the small opening. The metal was almost too hot to keep my hands on for long. Definitely creepy experience, considering the history of that boiler room.
Over VCRs. Can you imagine killing someone over a VCR? Oh no, beta.
Crawling into boilers? That's going to be a no-go for me.
Jeez. I'm not going to roll my eyes at double block and bleed anymore after reading that.
The 1904 Cincinnati Privy Disaster, out Beltmag Com's Cincinnati Privy-Disaster, 1904. In 1904, 9 schoolgirls drowned in an outhouse after the floor collapsed. They literally drowned in human waste.
This is the second post in this thread that features Cincinnati. For such an inconspicuous little Midwestern city, it does have a colorful history.
Fuck, drowning in shit was never a nightmare of mine, but it is now.
All right, so my preschool teacher, who also ended up somehow changing jobs and becoming my 11th grade English teacher, had a super interesting life. Her mother had some super famous book. Her father worked high up in the government, but enough about her family. First, let me describe her to you. She had dark hair and blue eyes. You'll see why this matters in a minute. She told this story every single year to the new students in her class. When she was younger, she was driving through Arizona on a 2-way road while her boyfriend at the time was following behind her on his motorcycle. For those who don't live in Arizona, certain stretches of it can be quite isolated and deserted. She said that they were on a long drive. It's been about 6 years since I was in her class, so details are fuzzy. But basically, her and her boyfriend both knew the destination where they were heading by memory and eventually got separated by a few miles. A man who was behind her in a Volkswagen Beetle kept pulling up beside her into the other lane. No one was coming, and motioning at her to pull over. She somewhat ignored him the first few times, but he kept doing it and began getting more frantic each time. She said that she believed that he spotted something wrong with her car, so she saw a parking lot off the road for a deserted gas station and pulled over. Once pulled over, she said that she instantly got an eerie feeling. The man was suspicious and kept telling her that he saw something wrong with her headlight and insisted she get out of the car so he could show her what he meant. Her boyfriend, who was a few miles behind her, eventually caught up and spotted her car at the sketchy gas station. Right as she was out of the car, her boyfriend began to pull in. As he did that, this man got into his car and sped off like his life depended on it. They later were able to identify that the man was Ted Bundy. She said she cannot imagine what would have happened to her if her boyfriend had been even another 3 miles behind her on the road. Edit, spelling, clarity of details.
Holy crap, man. Now that is wild.
Reminds me of my wife's family. A couple years before my wife was born, her parents lived in California, way out on this dirt road. Every few days, a group of hippies would walk by and ask my in-laws if they could have some water. My wife's parents were nice and would be like, "Oh, sure, here you go." Turns out it was the Manson family.
Please tell me you only heard this story in 11th grade and not preschool.
That giant billionaires, politicians, and celebrity all hide and cover for pedos and sex traffickers, and that they killed Jeffrey Epstein to cover it up.
Watching that aggregate of different documentaries about the subject on / conspiracy really opened my eyes to how common this stuff is all over the world. Started with an I, forgot what it was called. Every part of the world has had a little pocket of people in power that realized, hey, wait a minute, if we control everything we can do whatever we want. And then there is a common motif of regular police officer that tries to start an investigation, and they are told to cease their efforts. Some real evil stuff. Edit, searching took like 20 minutes, but I found it. Imperium.com/watch. I don't browse /r/conspiracy, but for some reason I was there one time because of a post on r/all a few months ago, and this documentary caught my eye because I like documentaries. It is some powerful stuff.
I did not know that Jeffrey Epstein thing was recent. But yeah, I believe the rich and powerful commit the most disgusting atrocities on Earth.
Imagine living your entire life in a work camp. Telegraph Co. UK / travel, destination / Asia, North Korea / galleries, what you didn't know about North Korea, / a 3 generations of punishment rule. Or, the only reason you're alive is for your organs. NBC News, WWW, NBC News, NCNA 010. Both being state-sponsored makes it that much more horrific.
That China thing reminds me of the book Never Let Me Go by Kazuo Ishiguro. It's crazy that kind of dystopia is reality somewhere right now.
Before looking at these articles, I bet it's North Korea. Edit.
That North Korea thing is so awful and so true. That state has weaponized its people through poverty and force. One of the reasons we, whoever we you want to consider, don't go in and liberate Korea, there are many reasons, this is only part of one, is because so many of the people live in such dire medieval conditions. Any coalitions of governments who take on rehabilitating, educating, and readying the population for the 21st century will be taking on a decades-long, if not generation-long project, one that saps the resources, energy, and finances of the governments who might help. Again, I'm not saying this is the only reason, but make no mistake about it, other governments are deeply wary of the daunting humanitarian crisis that would be unleashed on their hands. The Korean government has effectively weaponized their own people, and they know it.
In the late 1950s, the Soviet Union spearheaded a campaign to convince the World Health Organization that smallpox could be eradicated. Smallpox is a highly contagious disease that is specific to humans. Insofar as we know, no other species on Earth can get or carry smallpox. In 1977, the last case of smallpox was identified and snuffed out. The disease was eradicated. However, rather than destroy the final genetic samples of the disease, the Cold War superpowers decided to store it. Some went to the Soviet Union, and some went to the Centers for Disease Control in Atlanta, Georgia. The Soviets began a weaponization program. This means that they tried to make a stronger, more contagious, more lethal strain of smallpox. They tried to cross it with other diseases like Ebola, creating entirely artificial chimera diseases. They grew smallpox in the lab by the ton and kept it loaded, ready to be fired on missiles into the United States. But it's not a missile that's frightening. A single glass ampule of the stuff smashed against the wall of a subway station in New York or Chicago or Tokyo could spark a global outbreak. Very, very few people alive today have been vaccinated for smallpox, and there are but a scant few doses of vaccine available. In the event of an outbreak, our ability to manufacture vaccine would be rapidly outpaced. If the wrong person got their hands on the Soviet smallpox bioweapon, billions could die. Nuclear weapons are bad enough, but they, at least, require a general war to break out in order to bring about an end to human civilization. A smallpox bioweapon doesn't require a war, just one security breach.
That's some next-level Resident Evil crap, and is as fascinating as it is horrifying. Thank you for sharing.
The U.S. also has a bioweapons program that does the same sort of work. The mass Lyme disease outbreak the U.S. has experienced since the 1970s is allegedly the result of the American bioweapon program losing containment from their testing location offshore of Lyme, Connecticut, because they didn't know deer could swim off the island.
The bad thing is that in 2014, samples were found that had been misplaced. Carelessness could have led to a disaster. www.npr.org/207/32298884145. In a lab-sourced room, an unsettling surprise lost vials of smallpox.
Various torture murders are probably the most horrific things I've read about. Junko Furuta, who was a perfectly normal girl until she was kidnapped off the street by a gang for no reason, purely wrong place, wrong time, according to Japanese sources, and unimaginably raped and tortured to death over 44 days. Kiki Camarena, a DEA agent in Mexico, who was kidnapped by the Guadalajara cartel and tortured to death over about 3 days. His story is the central focus of the show Narcos Mexico. But from what I've read, his death was even more brutal than what they make it out to be. A detail consistent in both is that they brought in a doctor to revive him numerous times when he got too close to death and keep him conscious so he couldn't pass out from the pain. Kellyanne Bates, who was groomed from a young age by a scumbag who eventually killed her slowly over the course of about a month in their apartment. Her injuries were so horrific, the jury at the guy's trial had to get counseling. For example, her eyes were missing, and there were stab wounds in the sockets. Sylvia Likens, whose parents left her in the care of a woman who both personally and with the help of her children and their friends, degraded, tortured, and killed over several months. The Hello Kitty murder in China, where a man and his about 13-year-old girlfriend kidnapped a prostitute who had supposedly stolen from him, even though sources say she had paid him back with interest, tortured her to death, and then stuffed her corpse into a Hello Kitty toy. Baby Brianna, a newborn whose mother, father, and uncle tortured and raped her from the second they brought her home from the hospital until the second she died. Baby P, a British toddler whose mother let her boyfriend torture him to death. His back was broken in his last days of life. Honestly, there are just so many horrifically on par with each other. You could list them all day.
Sylvia Likens. I got sick just reading the name again. I was thinking of adding it here, but couldn't remember the last name. It was almost a relief after decades of this story sticking with me. And there was no way I could make myself go and look it up. Read it here. And instantly, I am sick. They mutilated that poor girl. They used her sister as a coercive threat. The caregiver not only encouraged her own children to torture Sylvia, but the neighborhood kids also came around and participated. Cops came to the house even. But the lack of punishment, the fact every participant paroled out and went on to become school teachers and ministers. I needed to make sure I had something right. And here is the basic wiki link. It doesn't go too much into the horrible details compared to other references. But I am now going to crawl in a hole for the next few weeks, stick to r/all for a while, have a drink, and enter recovery. EN. M. Wikipedia, org/murder of Sylvia Likens.
I can't even comprehend raping a 6-month-old, but it's literally fresh out the womb. And they go at it? Fucking monsters.
Actually, as for Junko Furuta, she wasn't just a random pick. She was generally well-liked in her school, and she was the choice because not only she was getting on their nerves, she turned down one of the guys who ended up kidnapping her. IDK where you got the information that she would have been a random choice, considering her relations to the predators is mentioned pretty much everywhere. That being said, for anyone not too squeamish, there is 44 Days of Hell that describes in detail what was done to her and the long process of her dying. It is not a pretty read, but pretty eye-opening.
100% true, as it happened to me. It's probably more spooky than scary. I'll let you be the judge. Many years ago, before there were cell phones, we had these things called pagers strapped to our hips. Someone would page you with their phone number, and you would call them back when you got to a phone. As an on-call technician working in the audiovisual field, my pager would go off all the freaking time. Like most people who used pagers, our clients knew that if you followed up your number with a 911, that would indicate to the technician to stop what they were doing and call right away. Although I was always busy, I rarely, if ever, got 911s. One afternoon, traveling from Orlando to St. Petersburg via Interstate 4, my pager goes off with a number I don't recognize, followed by the 911. I find the first exit and pull into a little truck stop-looking place outside of Plant City to use the payphone. This takes maybe 3 minutes tops. I walk in, ask for some change, and head to the wall where there are 4 payphones to choose from. I pop my quarter in and dial the number displayed on my trusty pager. It rings, and rings, and rings. I'm thinking to myself, WTF? Who would page me with a 911 and not answer their phone? It's just about then that I notice another ringing sound, in addition to the one in my ear. I pull the handset from my ear, and 2 phones over on the wall. Another payphone is ringing, but with an incoming call, I hang up the handset and the ringing stops on the other phone. I walk a few paces over, pick up the handset, and look at the phone number printed above the buttons. I look at the number on my pager. I look at the number on the phone. I look at the number on my pager again. I look at the phone again, except for the 911. They are identical. I kind of lose my breath for a second, and then I make my way over to the girl at the counter and ask if she saw anyone use the payphone. She said I was the only person in the store in the last hour. The whole episode probably took 15 minutes, but man, I was freaked out. The hair on the back of my neck was standing straight up, and I just wanted out of there. I get about 10 miles down the highway and come upon a scene that looked like a bomb went off. 4-car pileup involving a tractor trailer hauling a load of steel that had come loose, state troopers and paramedics just arriving. I pulled over to the side and helped the best I could, but it was all pretty much over once it began. I have no idea why I got that page or from whom or what, but I'm convinced that if I hadn't, I would not be alive to write this today.
I am almost 2 hours deep on this thread, and this is one of my favorite submissions. Crazy how the world works. I don't know much about pages, old enough to remember them, but never use them. But did you really receive the page at all? What if it was all a glitch?
Please, don't take this the wrong way. I'm only a few sentences, but I have to say it. I got a chuckle out of you explaining pagers, but honestly, I don't think most teenagers wouldn't know what a pager is. Like those videos of kids trying to use a rotary phone. Anyways, it put a smile on this old gal's face in a dark and scary thread. I'm gonna read your actual story now. ETA, I get why you explained it now. I don't think most people would understand that you were paged from the payphone you randomly stopped at. It's very spooky. Looks like someone's looking out for you. I-4 is a mess, and bless anyone who has to drive it.
God couldn't text, so he did that instead. Gosh, you were lucky.
Artemis Pyle, the drummer from Leonard Skynyrd, survived a plane crash and walked to a nearby house only to be shot by the homeowner. The homeowner saw a bloody, long-haired man and winged him. Pyle survived that as well and made a full recovery.
He's also a pedo, Google.com/amp, ashfigus/former Leonard Skynyrd drummer Artemis Pyle, having a tough time shaking past.
He's a registered sex offender now.
A family friend was cleaning her bus before the bus run. She had 2 small kids who were strapped into car seats in the bus. She swept the floor and was standing outside the bus, leaning in, using a dustpan and brush to collect the dirt she had swept up. The auto doors on the bus kicked in and closed on her neck. She suffocated while her 2 young children looked on, unable to do anything because they couldn't undo their car seat buckles.
I wonder what kind of bus this was. Every bus I can think of. The doors move pretty easily with force.
Wow.
I have been reading a lot of horrible stuff on this thread for a while now, and this one is going to be the one that gets me in the gut. God, that is so sad.
This is from South Africa. The woman is called Alison Botha, and she was abducted, raped, and then choked until she blacked out. She was driven into a secluded area, stabbed 30 times in the abdomen and 16 times in the throat, and left for dead on the side of the road. She had to use her shirt to keep her organs inside her body and hold her head up because of a damaged muscle in her neck, and proceeded to crawl to the road where she was eventually spotted and rescued. She survived the attack and now does motivational speaking, I believe, /Newcastle Advertiser, Z/40889, /hijacked, raped, stabbed, and still standing strong. And here is a link to the IMDb page for the documentary. IMDb. Karls 349 Ninfuge.
What a total badass.
For those wondering, documentary can be found on Amazon Prime Video.
It's amazing that she survived that.
In 3rd grade, a guy came to our school and held our class hostage. He had already killed his wife and was there to kill his kid. The administrators convinced him the kid was not there and to take one of their cars and leave. After threatening to kill us multiple times, tying up the gym teacher, and dragging someone's grandma around with a knife at her neck, he finally left about 30 minutes later. The police caught him in Indiana on his way to kill his parents. He was convinced the world was ending, and he was killing everyone he loved to spare them. The school did worse than nothing. They lied to parents, and no assistance was given to either the kids or teachers involved. The gym teacher never came back, and every time she would see one of the kids at the store or whatever, she had a breakdown. Several of us have PTSD undiagnosed for decades. We just thought it was normal. In the 70s, the Chicago public school system was more concerned about their jobs and lawsuits, so they covered it up.
Geez, was there any coverage of it at all?
That's horrible. And it reminded me of the day a disgruntled, recently fired postal worker killed his mother and shot a former co-worker at our local post office. It's a murderpedia, org, mail, H.H. Hilbun-Mark Richard, HTM. In the town I grew up, I was in 3rd grade then at the local elementary school, and they put the whole school on lockdown because the guy was on the run and they thought he might come to the school and kill kids. They didn't tell us what was going on, but there was no recess, and we weren't even allowed to go use the bathroom. Our teacher made a privacy screen out of large sheets of construction paper, and no joke, kids were told to pee in a bucket behind it. Obviously a much more tame story than yours. Holy moly. Later, my family moved into an apartment building, and we found out the killer had lived in the Cater Corner bottom unit from ours.
Damn, what CPS school was that?
Ex-girlfriend at just under 18 years old had her father attempt to rape her in her sleep, woke up to him attempting, and struggled endlessly until finally he got up and left. A few days later, he tried to offer her money for sex. A few weeks later, she turned 18, packed up her stuff, and I got her out of the house while he was at work. Over the course of the next 3 years, I stayed in a relationship with her while she lashed out and completely let loose. Cheating, partying, lying, fighting, etc. It completely ripped the girl's life apart, and she lost all inhibition. I stayed, so she had a constant to come home to. We're both in agreement that if I didn't stay, she'd probably be dead. We split up about 5 years ago, but are now best friends, and she's living a great life. It was hard for me not to do something to that dude.
My wife's dad raped her. He wouldn't let her go to prom unless she had sex with him, because in his words, no one will ever love you like me. Took everything I had not to cave his face in after I found that out. The damage he did to her is not quantifiable. Her mom and stepdad were worse, if you can believe it.
You're very much appreciated, man. Glad to hear she's doing well, and you guys are still close.
You are a great person.
In 1972, a Uruguayan plane carrying a college rugby team fell in the Andes mountain range. Of 50 people, 13 people died in the crash or the following hours, and by the next day the survivor count was down to 27, which with little food had to resort to eating the bodies of the dead, rationing how much each ate. After that, the remaining survivors made a pact stating that if they died, they would be the next in line for consumption, and that the only bodies that would be used would be the families of those who voluntarily accepted too. They spent 72 days in the hostile environment. By the end, only 16 survived. The most terrifying story, IMO, is when one of the survivors, who had broken his leg on the crash, which made him feel useless, noticed that the corpses up for consumption was running out. He secretly stopped eating to die of hunger and become of use for the survivors. Thankfully, one of them realized and managed to convince him to keep himself alive for 2 weeks more. The rescue team found them within those 2 weeks. I highly recommend you read the book Viven, or La Sociedad de la Nieve, to get more details. Bonus, a candidate for the Communist Party told one of the survivors, Roberto Canessa, that he didn't know what being hungry was like.
I think there was a movie made about this, Alive.
For some reason, a plane crash in a remote area involving a sports team reminded me of a story my tour guide in Costa Rica told me. I'm a bit fuzzy, so if anyone else knows the story, please step in. I think it was back in the 80s or 90s. A plane carrying a soccer team was flying through Costa Rica and crashed in the mountains. The geography in the area made it very difficult for the search parties to locate the site of the crash. And eventually the military got involved in the search. Now, there's a few tribes of native Costa Rican people, not sure of the proper term, that live in the jungle and very rarely come into towns to trade. A few weeks, months after the crash, some people from the tribes were seen wearing the jerseys of the team in the crash, along with some pieces of the military uniform. I believe the crash was never found as well.
Also read Miracle in the Andes by Nando Parado. Very insightful and an amazing story. Great book that I highly recommend to anyone about this subject.
The guy who predicted the Great Recession now exclusively invests in water.
He also predicted 14 of the last 3 recessions.
That is as unsettling as it is ominous.
You got any links about this? I'd like to read about him.
A female friend in college disappeared from a party at another university in the city town 25-ish miles north of our school. She had arrived with another friend who I believe had driven. At some point, she split off to play cornhole or something and was later inexplicably gone. Phone calls went to voicemail, police were called, but she was simply missing. About 10 days later, she was found by a homeless man who witnessed her crawling up to a bus stop in the city, begging for help. She had broken a leg and an arm and was in very bad shape. At the quite large party, she had her drink secretly drugged and was then led off by a group of men into their vehicle. She was taken to an apartment where she was drugged, repeatedly raped, and locked in a small room in between with a bucket to use as a bathroom. At one point, after being injected with heroin and raped, she somehow managed to convince one of her captors to allow her to use the actual bathroom to clean herself up. This bathroom had a small window to the outside, and with the shower running, she managed to squeeze out and fell from the 3rd story into a large hedge bush. From there, she crawled from the apartment complex to the road and bus stop, where the homeless man saw her and called police. Many cars stopped upon seeing her, making her captives unable to recapture her. 3 men were later arrested for the crime, after surveillance cameras allowed police to locate the apartment which she jumped from. She returned to our university almost 2 years later, graduated, and became a nurse. She was obviously traumatized, never partied again, carried a gun everywhere she could, and somehow moved on with life. It was a terrifying tale none of us ever forgot. She was an 18-year-old freshman when the incident happened.
Fucking hell. With the men college boys, that poor woman.
This is why we need guns.
News article. I'd love to read more about it.
Carol Durant was at a shopping mall in Salt Lake City in 1974 when she was approached by a man claiming to be a police officer. He said that someone had tried to break into her car and asked her to come with him. He then said he would drive her to the police station, and she got into his car. However, this guy was not a police officer, and he did not drive her to the police station, but rather pulled into a parking lot. He then cuffed her, pulled out a gun, and threatened to kill her if she resisted. Only, he messed up. He meant to cuff both of her wrists, but only managed to cuff one. She escaped and fought him off, despite being hit over the head several times. Her kidnapper was Ted Bundy. He killed another woman just 4 hours later. Her escape also helped identify Bundy, and she is part of the reason he was eventually arrested.
This is the second story I've seen of someone escaping Bundy.
2 run-ins with Ted Bundy in the same thread. Damn.
The whole documentary is nuts.
Ed Kemper murdered college women because his mother worked at a college, and he claims he wanted to destroy everything she loved. Then, he murdered his mother and decapitated her, raped her head and her body, set her head on a shelf and screamed at it for hours. That is the part that terrifies me. Then he murdered her best friend and turned himself in, relaying the whole story in detail, crying. Edit. It hurts because I'm not a lizard. I didn't crawl out from under a rock. I came from my mother's vagina, and in a rage, I went right back in. Ed Kemper quote from a police interview, Oxygen.com/Kemper on Kemper inside the mind of a serial killer's crime time. Ed Kemper, mother murder. Freaks me the hell out. Edit 111 days later. I'm still getting comments on this, so I'll add another thing that makes him creepy. He would bury the heads of the women he killed in his mother's backyard. He lived with her. He angled the head to where they were pointed upward, facing his mother's bedroom window. He would later say he did this purposely because his mother always wanted to be looked up to.
Check out Mindhunter on Netflix for a super creepy portrayal of Ed Kemper. That actor gives me chills and an impending sense of dread when he is on the screen.
He also used her head as a dartboard. He's the most disturbing of all the serial killers, in my opinion.
Somebody bought a house where a murder-suicide took place and found a $5,000 check in the walls alongside a letter written in Vietnamese that was addressed towards the killer.
You're going to have to elaborate. What did the letter say? Why wasn't the check cashed? How did this pertain to the murder-suicide other than proximity?
I recently bought a condo and got a good deal on it because the girl who owned it before had gone missing for years. She was eventually found, though. Basically, as a millennial, the best case scenario for buying property is a murder house. Tragedy equals value.
Is there a news article on this? I would like to know more information on this, like what the letter said and why $5,000.
When I was in 4th grade, we had buddy classes with 1st graders to help teach them how to write and read properly. My buddy was Cameron Bell, a 6-year-old blonde boy who was a bit quiet but loved to draw angry birds. One morning, I came to school and my teacher was in tears, a police officer in the room beside her. As we sat down after the bell rang, we were told that due to an unfortunate series of events, Cameron had passed away. After school, I rushed home to find out that due to the loss of his mother years prior, his father took him to the nearby church and shot him in the head before shooting himself. I still shake thinking about Cameron and the innocence that was taken. I missed his messy handwriting and Angry Birds drawings. It's been 9 years since the tragedy, and his smile still haunts me. Link to the article, /edu Oregon Live, com/argus/211.3 Hillsborough Father Shoots 6 EML.
Fuck, I'm devastated by this. The kid could have had a normal life. Grief is temporarily hell, but this is forever.
That is a horrific thing for a 10-year-old to have to deal with.
Something similar happened to a little girl I knew named Liel. She was the sweetest 9-year-old I ever met, and I babysat her a lot, and genuinely enjoyed it, which was unusual because kids typically annoyed me. Her father shot her and himself. My mom got a call from the mother's friend since she taught Liel piano and ukulele. We cried for quite a while. I was in complete shock. Apparently the parents were going through a rough divorce. Here's an article on it. www.google.com/s times her own times Israel's man kills daughter turns 9 in Texas murders suicides. I miss her every day.
Well, this one was quite dreadful for me at least. Whilst I was working back in 2006, I was working inside of a multi-story car park. I came down in the lift from the top floor where I was working at the time. As I got out the lift, there was a woman in her late 40s, I would say, with graying hair and a maroon handbag. We brushed shoulders as I got out the lift. I apologized. She gave me a very blank look. I walked out to go get some food, not thinking at the time much more than that. Although, when I think about it, the lady appeared to look quite sad. I returned with my noodles around 20 to 30 minutes later. At this point, I got back and police were everywhere. The lady had jumped from the top floor. I knew it was her from the handbag laying on the floor. Gosh, if I had stopped and spoke to her or left for lunch a little later, I may have been able to stop her jumping.
Gosh, if I had stopped and spoke to her or left for lunch a little later, I may have been able to stop her jumping. I hope you've talked to someone about this. It's not your fault, and there's no responsibility on you. You are a good person.
Buddy, you had no clue. It's not your fault. Nothing you said would have changed her mind, not being dark. I'm just saying from experience, friends tried to stop me from attempting suicide. Nothing they said worked. I'm so sorry you have to carry this guilt and weight on you. I wish I could take it off of you. You are amazing, and I hope you have an amazing day.
I hope you're okay. I witnessed a jumper when I was 19, and I started having panic attacks about it 11 years later. There are so many things that could have changed the moment, but you never know what could have been.
Not as scary as some of the stories here, but I was pretty horrified when my dad told me the story. There are some really big houses in the woods in my hometown. One of the owners went out drinking with his buddies and realized he forgot the key to the gate when he got home. So he decided to just climb the gate. While climbing in his drunken state, he slips and his leg gets pierced by one of the spikes on the gate. He was hanging there, but too afraid to call for his wife, since he was sure she would just open the automatic gate from inside the house. And since it was one of those gates that slides to the side, it would just rip his leg off if she did. He was hanging there the entire night until his wife woke up, saw him, and called the fire department. My dad, who was one of the firefighters that showed up, said they had to saw of the spike to get him off. Just imagine hanging from your own gate all night, not being able to call for help.
I live in a small city in the Rust Belt. A few years ago, I decided to take a ghost walk tour around downtown. It was morbid, but really interesting from a historical standpoint. One of the stops was in front of an old row house that had long been converted into offices. There was an old iron fence in front of the building. The fence was maybe 4 feet tall, but had ornamental spikes on the top of each post. The tour guide pointed to 3 of the spikes that were missing and said that after a window washer had fallen, they couldn't get his body off the fence without sawing off the spikes. That one really stuck with me.
Why didn't the guy just call his wife and tell her to call the police? Or why didn't he just call the police? I'm not doubting your story at all. I'm just confused.
This is insane, because when I was 16, this happened to my dad. I'm 30 now, and had completely forgotten about it until I read this story. We lived in a gated neighborhood in the wooded part of my hometown, too. Dad is alive and well, but that was a scary moment for us.
The people that bought my childhood home were murdered. The man that killed then snuck in and out of the house for a week. He would often slip into the house and be there for hours. He would hide in places that I knew. I knew them because as a kid, those were the best spots to hide for hide and seek. My favorite hiding spots were a killer's hiding spots.
That must be a horrible feeling thinking about that. So insane.
How did you find out where he was hiding and where? Just curious.
Where did you like to hide? Why was he sneaking around, just to be even more creepy?
A colleague of my dad's went on holiday to a small cottage in Wales, in the middle of nowhere, in the UK's wintertime, with his wife. They were found by the owner of the house after the week they rented it for was up, completely insane, clawing at their skin, and the whole place was a wreck. The full story was never found out, but the guy and his wife both were rambling about a red knife that followed them wherever they went, that they found in the bed of the cottage. They are both still alive, and as far as I'm aware, under psychiatric care. Edit. A couple people are saying it could be carbon monoxide poisoning resulting in brain damage, thus hallucinations and insanity. This was also suspected by police and investigators. The house had a carbon monoxide alarm, and it wasn't tripped. No red knife was ever found.
What kind of yellow wallpaper shit is this?
Excuse me, TTF.
Need a link for this?
This one terrifies me. I'm going to be purposely kind of vague about this, since I'm figuring the events in this story are rare. Edit. The stories told in the comments have now made me realize this happens fairly often, and that's very tragic. The events are also mostly speculative, since there weren't any witnesses. I say this to spare you all the multiple probably, and most likelies that would otherwise be in this post. This is how it was told to me. A family member of mine is friends with a man, middle-aged, whose wife sadly died while taking their dog out for a walk through a rural area they were visiting. They had driven up to a farm along the road and gotten out when the dog tore from her grip and ran off. She ran after it to the back of the barn where the huge open dung cistern was. The farmer wasn't home, so when he came back later in the day, he found her car and thought it weird that a strange car had just been left there, doors open, with no people noticeably nearby. He went around searching for his unexpected visitors and eventually found them. What he found was something I had never even imagined before hearing of this. The dog had fallen into the cistern of deep, liquid waste from the farm animals. The edges on the cistern were way too high up to reach from liquid surface level, and the woman must have panicked because she had jumped in after the dog to save it. And that's where her life slowly and brutally came to an end. The fumes that accumulate from that much dung are very toxic. The woman, after being unable to get back out, had lost consciousness and drowned, along with her dog, in a pool of cow shit. I can't imagine a worse way to die. I think about it now and then and hope that no one will ever die like that again. Poor souls.
I grew up on a goat bunny farm, and we had one of those. It was near the bunny pens because we had misc animals too. One night, I was running from my house down the road to my grandparents', and it was pitch black since we lived in the country. I'm talking the nearest light for miles was the one coming from the windows of the house. I narrowly avoided falling in that whole well/cistern by like a foot. I lived in a place so secluded and backwater, the nearest hospital was over an hour away, and the street was named after our family who built the property. I can't imagine. I just can't. This story of yours scares me pretty badly. Mind you, it wasn't that long ago. I'm only 24. Edit. I've lived through some weird stuff.
My dad fell into a tank full of manure as a child, too. Thankfully, my grandfather saved him. Not to mention that your lungs will get filled with it afterwards. What a way to go.
IDK about this being rare. We had stories about kids dying in similar vein. As sad as it is not uncommon for people to fall in and drown in septic tanks.
Probably the one about the guy at a local factory who went inside one of the welding machines, I think that's what they are called, to clean or do some kind of maintenance. And somehow, despite all the safety protocols, another employee kicked it on. Apparently, the moment it happened, the employee that did it realized his mistake. But there was no way to stop it once it started the firing cycle. Yes, the man inside died pretty quickly. But I cannot imagine being the person who made such a horrible mistake.
Lockout tagout is our friend. It would have saved him.
Here's a similar horrifying story. ABC News, BBC, QCO UK /hi/443939 STM.